Section 10 of The Diamond Lens with Other Stories by Fitz-James O'Brien. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. What was it? It is, I confess, with considerable diffidence that I approach the strange narrative which I am about to relate. The events which I propose detailing are of so extraordinary a character that I am quite prepared to meet with an unusual amount of incredulity and scorn. I accept all such beforehand. I have, I trust, the literary courage to face unbelief. I have, after mature consideration, resolved to narrate, in as simple and straightforward a manner as I can compass, some facts that passed under my observation in the month of July last, and which in the annals of the mysteries of physical science are wholly unparalleled. I live at No. 26th Street in New York. The house is in some respects a curious one. It has enjoyed for the last 2 years the reputation of being haunted. It is a large and stately residence, surrounded by what was once a garden, but which is now only a green enclosure used for bleaching clothes. The dry basin of what has been a fountain, and a few fruit trees ragged and unpruned, indicate that this spot in past days was a pleasant, shady retreat, filled with fruits and flowers and the sweet murmur of waters. The house is very spacious. A hall of noble size leads to a large spiral staircase winding through its center, while the various apartments are of imposing dimensions. It was built some 15 or 20 years since by Mr. A., the well-known New York merchant who 5 years ago threw the commercial world into convulsions by a stupendous bank fraud. Mr. A., as everyone knows, escaped to Europe and died not long after of a broken heart. Almost immediately after the news of his decease reached this country and was verified, the report spread in 26th Street that No. was haunted. Legal measures had dispossessed the widow of its former owner, and it was inhabited merely by a caretaker and his wife, placed there by the house agent into whose hands it had passed for purposes of renting or sale. These people declared that they were troubled with unnatural noises. Doors were opened without any visible agency. The remnants of furniture scattered throughout the various rooms were, during the night, piled one upon the other by unknown hands. Invisible feet passed up and down the stairs in broad daylight, accompanied by the rustle of unseen silk dresses, and the gliding of viewless hands along the massive balusters. The caretaker and his wife declared they would live there no longer. The house agent laughed, dismissed them, and put others in their place. The noises and supernatural manifestations continued. The neighborhood caught up the story, and the house remained untenanted for 3 years. Several persons negotiated for it, but somehow, always before the bargain was closed, they heard the unpleasant rumors and declined to treat any further. It was in this state of things that my landlady, who at that time kept a boarding house in Bleecker Street, and who wished to move further uptown, conceived the bold idea of renting No. 26th Street. Happening to have in her house rather a plucky and philosophical set of boarders, she laid her scheme before us, stating candidly everything she had heard respecting the ghostly qualities of the establishment to which she wished to remove us. With the exception of 2 timid persons, a sea captain and a returned Californian, who immediately gave notice that they would leave, all of Mrs. Moffat's guests declared that they would accompany her in her chivalric incursion into the abode of spirits. Our removal was effected in the month of May, and we were charmed with our new residence. The portion of 26th Street where our house is situated, between 7th and 8th Avenues, is one of the pleasantest localities in New York. The gardens back of the houses, running down nearly to the Hudson, form, in the summertime, a perfect avenue of verdure. The air is pure and invigorating, sweeping, as it does, straight across the river from the Weehawken Heights. And even the ragged garden which surrounded the house, although displaying on washing days rather too much clothesline, still gave us a piece of greensward to look at, and a cool retreat in the summer evenings, where we smoked our cigars in the dusk and watched the fireflies flashing their dark lanterns in the long grass. Of course, we had no sooner established ourselves at No. than we began to expect the ghosts. We absolutely awaited their advent with eagerness. Our dinner conversation was supernatural. One of the boarders who had purchased Mrs. Crow's Night Sight of Nature for his own private delectation was regarded as a public enemy by the entire household for not having bought 20 copies. The man led a life of supreme wretchedness while he was reading this volume. A system of espionage was established of which he was the victim, If he incautiously laid the book down for an instant and left the room, it was immediately seized and read aloud in secret places to a select few. I found myself a person of immense importance, it having leaked out that I was tolerably well versed in the history of supernaturalism, and had once written a story the foundation of which was a ghost. If a table or a wainscot panel happened to warp when we were assembled in the large drawing-room, there was an instant silence, and everyone was prepared for an immediate clanking of chains in a spectral form. After a month of psychological excitement, it was with the utmost dissatisfaction that we were forced to acknowledge that nothing in the remotest degree approaching the supernatural had manifested itself. Once the black butler asseverated that his candle had been blown out by some invisible agency while he was undressing himself for the night. But as I had more than once discovered this colored gentleman in a condition when one candle must have appeared to him like two, I thought it possible that, by going a step further in his potations, he might have reversed this phenomenon, and seen no candle at all where he ought to have beheld one. Things were in this state when an incident took place so awful and inexplicable in its character that my reason fairly reels at the bare memory of the occurrence. It was the 10th of July. After dinner was over, I repaired, with my friend Dr. Hammond, to the garden to smoke my evening pipe. Independent of certain mental sympathies which existed between the doctor and myself, we were linked together by a vice. We both smoked opium. We knew each other's secret and respected it. We enjoyed together that wonderful expansion of thought, that marvelous intensifying of the perceptive faculties, that boundless feeling of existence when we seemed to have points of contact with the whole universe. In short, that unimaginable spiritual bliss, which I would not surrender for a throne, and which I hope you, reader, will never, never taste. Those hours of opium happiness which the doctor and I spent together in secret were regulated with a scientific accuracy. We did not blindly smoke the drug of paradise and leave our dreams to chance. While smoking, we carefully steered our conversation through the brightest and calmest channels of thought. We talked of the East and endeavored to recall the magical panorama of its glowing scenery. We criticized the most sensuous poets, those who painted life ruddy with health, brimming with passion, happy in the possession of youth and strength and beauty. If we talked of Shakespeare's Tempest, we lingered over Ariel and avoided Caliban. Like the Gubers, we turned our face to the east and saw only the sunny side of the world. The skillful coloring of our train of thought produced in our subsequent visions a corresponding tone. The splendors of Arabian fairyland dyed our dreams. We paced that narrow strip of grass with the tread and port of kings. The song of the Rana Arborea, while he clung to the bark of the ragged plum tree, sounded like the strains of divine musicians. Houses, walls, and streets melted like rain clouds, and vistas of unimaginable glory stretched away before us. It was a rapturous companionship. We enjoyed the vast delight more perfectly because, even in our most ecstatic moments, we were conscious of each other's presence. Our pleasures, while individual, were still twin, vibrating and moving in musical accord. On the evening in question, the 10th of July, the doctor and myself drifted into an unusually metaphysical mood. We lit our large meerschaums, filled with fine Turkish tobacco, in the core of which burned a little black nut of opium that, like the nut in the fairy tale, held within its narrow limits wonders beyond the reach of kings. We paced to and fro conversing. A strange perversity dominated the currents of our thought. They would not flow through the sunlit channels into which we strove to divert them. For some unaccountable reason, they constantly diverged into dark and lonesome beds where a continual gloom brooded. It was in vain that, after our old fashion, we flung ourselves on the shores of the East and talked of its gay bazaars, of the splendors of the time of Harun, of harems and golden palaces. Black afrits continually arose from the depths of our talk and expanded like the one the fisherman released from the copper vessel, until they blotted everything bright from our vision. Insensibly we yielded to the occult force that swayed us, and indulged in gloomy speculation. We had talked some time upon the proneness of the human mind to mysticism, and the almost universal love of the terrible, when Hammond suddenly said to me, "What do you consider to be the greatest element of terror?" The question puzzled me. That many things were terrible I knew. Stumbling over a corpse in the dark, beholding, as I once did, a woman floating down a deep and rapid river, with wildly lifting arms and awful upturned face, uttering, as she drifted, shrieks that rent one's heart, while we, the spectators, stood frozen at a window which overhung the river at a height of 60 feet, unable to make the slightest effort to save her, but dumbly watching her last supreme agony in her disappearance. A shattered wreck, with no life visible, encountered floating listlessly on the ocean, is a terrible object, for it suggests a huge terror, the proportions of which are veiled. But it now struck me for the first time that there must be one great and ruling embodiment of fear, a king of terrors, to which all others must succumb. What might it be? To what train of circumstances would it owe its existence? "I confess, Hammond," I replied to my friend, "I never considered the subject before, that there must be one something more terrible than any other thing I feel. I cannot attempt, however, even the most vague definition." "I am somewhat like you, Harry," he answered. "I feel my capacity to experience a terror greater than anything yet conceived by the human mind, something combining in fearful and unnatural amalgamation hitherto supposed incompatible elements. The calling of the voices in Brockden Brown's novel of Wyland is awful. So is the picture of the Dweller of the Threshold in Bulwer's Zanoni. But," he added, shaking his head gloomily, "there is something more horrible still than these." "Look here, Hammond," I rejoined, "let us drop this kind of talk for heaven's sake. We shall suffer for it, depend on it." "I don't know what's the matter with me tonight," he replied, "but my brain is running upon all sorts of weird and awful thoughts. I feel as if I could write a story like Hoffman tonight, if I were only a master of a literary style." "Well, if we are going to be Hoffman-esque in our talk, I am off to bed. Opium and nightmares should never be brought together. How sultry it is. Good night, Hammond. Good night, Harry. Pleasant dreams to you." "To you, gloomy wretch, afrits, ghouls, and enchanters." We parted, and each sought his respective chamber. I undressed quickly and got into bed, taking with me, according to my usual custom, a book, over which I generally read myself to sleep. I opened the volume as soon as I had laid my head upon the pillow and instantly flung it to the other side of the room. It was Goudon's History of Monsters, a curious French work which I had lately imported from Paris, but which in the state of mind I had then reached was anything but an agreeable companion. I resolved to go to sleep at once, so, turning down my gas until nothing but a little blue point of light glimmered on the top of the tube, I composed myself to rest. The room was in total darkness. The atom of gas that still remained alight did not illuminate a distance of 3 inches round the burner. I desperately drew my arm across my eyes, as if to shut out even the darkness, and tried to think of nothing. It was in vain. The confounded themes touched on by Hammond in the garden kept obtruding themselves on my brain. I battled against them. I erected ramparts of would-be blankness of intellect to keep them out. They still crowded upon me. While I was lying still as a corpse, hoping that by a perfect physical inaction I should hasten mental repose, an awful incident occurred. A something dropped, as it seemed, from the ceiling, plumb upon my chest, and the next instant I felt 2 bony hands encircling my throat, endeavoring to choke me. I am no coward, and am possessed of considerable physical strength. The suddenness of the attack, instead of stunning me, strung every nerve to its highest tension. My body acted from instinct before my brain had time to realize the terrors of my position. In an instant I wound 2 muscular arms around the creature, and squeezed it with all the strength of despair against my chest. In a few seconds the bony hands that had fastened on my throat loosened their hold, and I was free to breathe once more. Then commenced a struggle of awful intensity. Immersed in the most profound darkness, totally ignorant of the nature of the thing by which I was so suddenly attacked, finding my grasp slipping every moment by reason, it seemed to me of the entire nakedness of my assailant, bitten with sharp teeth in the shoulder, neck, and chest, having every moment to protect my throat against a pair of sinewy, agile hands, which my utmost efforts could not confine. These were a combination of circumstances to combat which required all the strength, skill, and courage that I possessed. At last, after a silent, deadly, exhausting struggle, I got my assailant under by a series of incredible efforts of strength. Once pinned with my knee on what I made out to be its chest, I knew that I was the victor. I rested for a moment to breathe. I heard the creature beneath me panting in the darkness, and felt the violent throbbing of a heart. It was apparently as exhausted as I was. That was one comfort. At this moment I remembered that I usually placed under my pillow before going to bed a large yellow silk pocket handkerchief. I felt for it instantly. It was there. In a few seconds more, I had, after a fashion, pinioned the creature's arms. I now felt tolerably secure. There was nothing more to be done but to turn on the gas, and having first seen what my midnight assailant was like, arouse the household. I will confess to being actuated by a certain pride in not giving the alarm before. I wished to make the capture alone and unaided. Never losing my hold for an instant, I slipped from the bed to the floor, dragging my captive with me. I had but a few steps to make to reach the gas burner. These I made with the greatest caution, holding the creature in a grip like vice. At last I got within arm's length of the tiny speck of blue light, which told me where the gas burner lay. Quick as lightning, I released my grasp with one hand and let on the full flood of light. Then I turned to look at my captive. I cannot even attempt to give any definition of my sensations the instant after I turned on the gas. I suppose I must have shrieked with terror, for in less than a minute afterward my room was crowded with the inmates of the house. I shudder now as I think of that awful moment. I saw nothing. Yes. I had one arm firmly clasped around a breathing, panting, corporeal shape. My other hand gripped with all its strength a throat as warm and apparently fleshly as my own. And yet, with this living substance in my grasp, with its body pressed against my own, and all in the bright glare of a large jet of gas, I absolutely beheld nothing. Not even an outline. A vapor. I do not even at this hour realize the situation in which I found myself. I cannot recall the astounding incident thoroughly. Imagination in vain tries to compass the awful paradox. It breathed. I felt its warm breath upon my cheek. It struggled fiercely. It had hands. They clutched me. Its skin was smooth like my own. There it lay, pressed close up against me, solid as stone, and yet utterly invisible. I wonder that I did not faint or go mad on the instant. Some wonderful instinct must have sustained me, for absolutely in place of loosening my hold on the terrible enigma, I seemed to gain an additional strength in my moment of horror, and tightened my grasp with such wonderful force that I felt the creature shivering with agony. Just then Hammond entered my room at the head of the household. As soon as he beheld my face, which I suppose must have been an awful sight to look at, he hastened forward, crying, "Great heaven, Harry! What has happened?" "Hammond! Hammond!" I cried. "Come here! Oh, this is awful. I have been attacked in bed by something or other, which I have hold of. But I can't see it. I can't see it." Hammond, doubtless struck by the unfeigned horror expressed in my countenance, made one or two steps forward with an anxious yet puzzled expression. A very audible titter burst from the remainder of my visitors. This suppressed laughter made me furious. To laugh at a human being in my position. It was the worst species of cruelty. Now I can understand why the appearance of a man struggling violently as it would seem with an airy nothing and calling for assistance against a vision should have appeared ludicrous. Then, so great was my rage against the mocking crowd that had I the power I would have stricken them dead where they stood. "Hammond! Hammond!" I cried again despairingly. "For God's sake, come to me! I can hold the thing but a short while longer. It is overpowering me. Help me! Help me!" "Harry," whispered Hammond, approaching me, "you have been smoking too much opium." "I swear to you, Hammond, that this is no vision," I answered in the same low tone. "Don't you see how it shakes my whole frame with its struggles? If you don't believe me, convince yourself. Feel it. Touch it." In a moment he had discovered somewhere in my room a long piece of cord, and was the next instant winding it and knotting it about the body of the unseen being that I clasped in my arms. "Harry," he said in a hoarse, agitated voice, for though he preserved his presence of mind, he was deeply moved. "Harry, it's all safe now. You may let go, old fellow, if you're tired. The thing can't move." I was utterly exhausted, and I gladly loosed my hold. Hammond stood holding the ends of the cord that bound the invisible, twisting round his hand, while, before him, self-supporting as it were, he beheld a rope laced and interlaced, and stretching tightly around a vacant space. I never saw a man look so thoroughly stricken with awe. Nevertheless, his face expressed all the courage and determination which I knew him to possess. His lips, although white, were set firmly, and one could perceive at a glance that, although stricken with fear, he was not daunted. The confusion that ensued among the guests of the house, who were witnesses of this extraordinary scene between Hammond and myself, who beheld the pantomime of binding this struggling something, who beheld me almost sinking from physical exhaustion when my task of jailer was over, the confusion and terror that took possession of the bystanders when they saw all this was beyond description. The weaker ones fled from the apartment. The few who remained clustered near the door and could not be induced to approach Hammond and his charge. Still, incredulity broke out through their terror. They had not the courage to satisfy themselves, and yet they doubted. It was in vain that I begged of some of the men to come near and convince themselves by touch of the existence in that room of a living being which was invisible. They were incredulous, but did not dare to undeceive themselves. How could such a solid, living, breathing body be invisible? They asked. My reply was this. I gave a sign to Hammond, and both of us, conquering our fearful repugnance to touch the invisible creature, lifted it from the ground, manacled as it was, and took it to my bed. Its weight was about that of a boy of 14. Now, my friends, I said as Hammond and myself held this creature suspended over the bed, I can give you self-evident proof that here is a solid, ponderable body, which nevertheless you cannot see. Be good enough to watch the surface of the bed attentively. I was astonished at my own courage in treating this strange event so calmly, but I had recovered from my first terror, and felt a sort of scientific pride in the affair, which dominated every other feeling. The eyes of the bystanders were immediately fixed on my bed. At a given signal, Hammond and I let the creature fall. There was the dull sound of a heavy body alighting on a soft mass. The timbers of the bed creaked. A deep impression marked itself distinctly on the pillow and on the bed itself. The crowd who witnessed this gave a low cry and rushed from the room. Hammond and I were left alone with our mystery. We remained silent for some time, listening to the low, irregular breathing of the creature on the bed, and watching the rustle of the bedclothes as it impotently struggled to free itself from confinement. Then Hammond spoke. "Harry, this is awful." "Aye, awful. But not unaccountable." "Not unaccountable? What do you mean? Such a thing has never occurred since the birth of the world. I know not what to think, Hammond. God grant that I am not mad, and that this is not an insane fantasy." "Let us reason a little, Harry. Here is a solid body, which we touch, but which we cannot see. The fact is so unusual that it strikes us with terror. Is there no parallel, though, for such a phenomenon? Take a piece of pure glass. It is tangible and transparent. A certain chemical coarseness is all that prevents its being so entirely transparent as to be totally invisible. It is not theoretically impossible, mind you, to make a glass which shall not reflect a single ray of light, a glass so pure and homogeneous in its atoms that the rays from the sun will pass through it as they do through the air, refracted but not reflected. We do not see the air, yet we feel it." "That's all very well, Hammond, but these are inanimate substances. Glass does not breathe. Air does not breathe. This thing has a heart that palpitates, a will that moves it, lungs that play and inspire and respire." "You forget the phenomena of which we have so often heard of late," answered the doctor gravely. "At the meetings called spirit circles, invisible hands have been thrust into the hands of those persons round the table, warm, fleshly hands that seem to pulsate with mortal life. What? Do you think, then, that this thing is—" "I don't know what it is," was the solemn reply. "But please the gods, I will, with your assistance, thoroughly investigate it." We watched together, smoking many pipes all night long by the bedside of the unearthly being that tossed and panted, until it was apparently wearied out. Then we learned by the low, regular breathing that it slept. The next morning the house was all astir. The boarders congregated on the landing outside my room, and Hammond and myself were lions. We had to answer 1,000 questions as to the state of our extraordinary prisoner, for as yet not one person in the house except ourselves could be induced to set foot in the apartment. The creature was awake. This was evidenced by the convulsive manner in which the bedclothes were moved in its efforts to escape. There was something truly terrible in beholding, as it were, those second-hand indications of the terrible writhings and agonized struggles for liberty which themselves were invisible. Hammond and myself had racked our brains during the long night to discover some means by which we might realize the shape and general appearance of the enigma. As well as we could make out by passing our hands over the creature's form, its outlines and lineaments were human. There was a mouth, a round smooth head without hair, a nose which, however, was little elevated above the cheeks, and its hands and feet felt like those of a boy. At first we thought of placing the being on a smooth surface and tracing its outline with chalk as shoemakers trace the outline of the foot. This plan was given up as being of no value. Such an outline would give not the slightest idea of its conformation. A happy thought struck me. We would take a cast of it in plaster of Paris. This would give us the solid figure and satisfy all our wishes. But how to do it? The movements of the creature would disturb the setting of the plastic covering and distort the mold. Another thought, why not give it chloroform? It had respiratory organs, that was evident by its breathing. Once reduced to a state of insensibility, we could do with it what we would. Dr. X was sent for, and after the worthy physician had recovered from the first shock of amazement, he proceeded to administer the chloroform. In 3 minutes afterward, we were enabled to remove the fetters from the creature's body, and a modeler was busily engaged in covering the invisible form with the moist clay. In 5 minutes more, we had a mold, and before evening, a rough facsimile of the mystery. It was shaped like a man, distorted, uncouth, and horrible, but still a man. It was small, not over 4 feet and some inches in height, and its limbs revealed a muscular development that was unparalleled. Its face surpassed in hideousness anything I had ever seen. Gustave Doré, or Callot, or Tony Johano never conceived anything so horrible. There was a face in one of the latter's illustrations to Un voyage où il vous plaira, which somehow approaches the countenance of this creature, but does not equal it. It was the physiognomy of what I should fancy a ghoul might be. It looked as if it was capable of feeding on human flesh. Having satisfied our curiosity and bound everyone in the house to secrecy, it became a question what was to be done with our enigma. It was impossible that we should keep such a horror in our house. It was equally impossible that such an awful being should be let loose upon the world. I confess that I would have gladly voted for the creature's destruction. But who would shoulder the responsibility? Who would undertake the execution of this horrible semblance of a human being? Day after day this question was deliberated gravely. The boarders all left the house. Mrs. Moffat was in despair, and threatened Hammond and myself with all sorts of legal penalties if we did not remove the horror. Our answer was, we will go if you like, but we decline taking this creature with us. Remove it yourself, if you please. It appeared in your house. On you the responsibility rests. To this there was, of course, no answer. Mrs. Moffat could not obtain for love or money a person who would even approach the mystery. The most singular part of the affair was that we were entirely ignorant of what the creature habitually fed on. Everything in the way of nutriment that we could think of was placed before it, but was never touched. It was awful to stand by day after day and see the clothes toss, and hear the hard breathing, and know that it was starving. 10, 12 days, a fortnight passed, and it still lived. The pulsations of the heart, however, were daily growing fainter, and had now nearly ceased. It was evident that the creature was dying for want of sustenance. While this terrible life struggle was going on, I felt miserable. I could not sleep. Horrible as the creature was, it was pitiful to think of the pangs it was suffering. At last it died. Hammond and I found it cold and stiff one morning in the bed. The heart had ceased to beat, the lungs to inspire. We hastened to bury it in the garden. It was a strange funeral, the dropping of that viewless corpse into the damp hole. The cast of its form I gave to Dr. X, who keeps it in his museum in 10th Street. As I am on the eve of a long journey from which I may not return, I have drawn up this narrative of an event the most singular that has ever come to my knowledge. End of section 10. Section 11 of The Diamond Lens with Other Stories by Fitz-James O'Brien. LibriVox recordings in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Duke Humphrey's Dinner. Footnote. O'Brien wrote a little comedy on the same subject treated in this story, which was produced at Wallack's Theatre February 4th, 1856, with Mr. Lester Wallack as Berdoon and Mrs. Hoy as Agnes. Editor. In footnote. Have we no more coal, Agnes? No more.
What the deuce are we going to do for fire?
I haven't the slightest idea, Dick. You're clever. Why don't you invent some way of warming oneself without the aid of fire?
If you were a man, I could box with you, said Dick, looking meditatively at his wife as if wondering whether she could stand a round or two. Boxing warms one up famously, but then we have no gloves.
No, said Agnes with a laugh, and we shall have no shoes either in a very short time. And she pushed out as she spoke a little foot with a dilapidated slipper on it.
What a funny thing it is to have no money, Agnes, said Dick, gazing at a very small fire which smoldered in the grate with a rather contemplative air. Do you know that if it wasn't so confoundedly cold, I'd rather enjoy poverty? Now, in the summertime, there must be something very piquant in misery.
Only to think, answered Agnes, of the thousands of dollars that I've thrown away on follies when a 10th part of the sum would be a perfect dream of happiness now.
At present, $5 would present as magnificent an appearance as the English national debt in gold sovereigns.
Do you remember the ball at which you first proposed to me, Dick?
Don't I?
The large, lofty rooms glowing with burnished gold and soft lights, the carpets with their elastic, mossy pile, into which one's feet sank so far and so pleasantly that they became loath to leave their nests, making one lounge lazily instead of walking. The conservatory, dimly lit with colored lamps, where tropical leaves nodded heavily, as if bathed in eastern dreams, and the rich scent of the tuberoses wandered through the trees like the souls of dead flowers, roaming in search of some bloomy paradise. The music streaming through the wide doors of the dancing rooms and quivering off into the distance. The rustle of rich silks, the murmur of the thousand voices, the light, the perfume, the glory of youth and joy, spreading over everything like an atmosphere of human sunshine, which myriads of gay and splendid butterflies floated. Don't you remember, Dick?
I do, answered Dick, with rather a sad smile and a glance round the wretched room in which they were sitting. I remember well the glories of the life in which you were born, and the contrast, strange enough, with the life to which I have brought you. You have described the past, let me describe the present. A 4th-story room in a tumble-down tenement house in the filthiest part of Mulberry Street. German shoemakers and Irish washerwomen above and below us. No furniture save a table and a pallet bed. A couple of old wine boxes to sit on in place of chairs. 2 feet of snow on the ground and no coal. An exceedingly healthy and promising hunger gnawing at both of us, and no money to buy food. All our available goods sold or pawned long ago, repudiated by our relatives because we chose to marry each other on the ridiculous basis of mutual affection, all our efforts to obtain work being constantly frustrated by either Providence or his satanic majesty. Just enough of inconvenient pride left in us to prevent us from begging. And I think, my dear Agnes, you have as pretty a case for suicide as ever came up in evidence before a Paris police court. Don't you feel like a pan of charcoal in a last embrace, or a dose of strychnine in a despairing letter to our friends? I would offer you a pair of pistols and a mutual shooting arrangement, but at present my account at the merchant's bank is rather confused, and I do not like to draw a check for any amount until it is settled. And the young husband laughed as heartily as if the whole thing were a sort of comedy which he was rehearsing, and which he thought he was doing exceedingly well.
Dick,
said his wife very earnestly, coming round to where her husband sat, and kissing him gently on the forehead.
Dick, you are jesting, are you not? You have no such ideas, I trust.
Jesting? Of course I am, you dear little puss. Of all the unphilosophical things a man can do, killing himself is about the most unphilosophical. To kill another man is unphilosophical because the chances are 10 to 1 that the murder will be discovered, and the perpetrator hanged. Therefore, murder is only a devious way of committing suicide, with the additional disadvantage of having killed a fellow creature. But as far as regards the individual, suicide is still more unphilosophical than murder, for you do not allow yourself even a chance of escape. We may have to die of starvation, my dear little mentor, though I think it unlikely. If we have, however, the best thing we can do is to use all the means in our power to avert the unpleasant occurrence, and if it comes, meet it manfully. You may say womanfully if you choose. But if we were to kill ourselves by poison in order to avoid dying 20 hours later of starvation, don't you think we should be doing rather an absurd thing? particularly if, after we were dead, our spirits discovered that Providence would have sent us at the 19th hour some guardian angel in shape of a friend who would have relieved us from all our misery. No, my dear, we won't have any prussic acid or French exits from life. When we are too weak to stand up, we will lie down side by side. And when we are too exhausted to live, we will clasp our hands together, bless God with our last breath, and die like the babes in the wood. Perhaps after we are dead, that Irish washerwoman who lives in the 5th story may come in, like the robin in the legend, and cover us with leaves. She isn't very like a robin, certainly, continued Dick with an air of mock meditation, for she swears frightfully, and I regret to say smells of whiskey. This struck the pair as so very comic an idea that they simultaneously clapped their hands and burst into peals of laughter. To hear those shrieks of merriment, one would have thought this young couple the blithest and most careless creatures in the world. Their history was a simple romance. They were both orphans, the only difference being that Agnes Grey was an orphan with rich relatives, and Richard Burdoon an orphan with no relatives at all. Agnes had been adopted by her uncle, an old bachelor who lived in Boston, a selfish old man who, once he took possession of the poor girl, looked on her as his personal property, and regarded all who would seek to deprive him of her as atrocious burglars, worthy of the extremest penalties of the law. He petted her then as Caligula petted his favorite horse. She was clothed in purple and fine linen, and had her gilded stable. Agnes Grey had but to express a desire, and every luxury that wealth could purchase dropped at her feet from the hands of the abominable old fairy, her uncle. She gave balls and matinees, and rode on Arab steeds. Her jewels were the newest and the most wonderful, her dresses unimaginably well-fitting. Having wealth, beauty, and an indulgent guardian, this charming young girl wanted but one thing, a lover. It is a curious dispensation of Providence that while some young ladies are all their lives waiting for lovers, that commodity never arrives, whereas others have scarce begun to feel the vague desire. When, lo, it rains and hails and snows any quantity of adoring young gentlemen. Agnes Grey, then, had scarcely conjured up the youngest of desires in her most secret heart, when the wall opened and Mr. Richard Burdoon, stepping out, proclaimed himself her lover. I don't mean to say that the wall opened in reality, but it is a metaphorical way I have of expressing that he arrived in the nick of time. They met at a party. Mr. Burdoon, having been left a few $1,000s just 1 year previously by the death of his only surviving relative, set off for Europe to spend them. He succeeded to admiration, and, at the time I speak of, had just returned with an immense deal of useless experience and just $350. Considering very properly that so enormous a capital justified any folly, he ran off with Miss Agnes Grey without consulting her avuncular dragon. That jealous old relative, wounded in his tenderest spot, raged like a fury, disowned his unhappy niece, and swore a solemn oath that he would let her die of starvation ere he would assist her. At first Agnes and her husband mentally whistled at his threats. Had they not $350? Armed with so incalculable a sum, what cared they for poverty? They came to New York. Ah, how quickly did the scenes in the panorama succeed each other! Metropolitan Hotel and fine apartments, then boarding-house, and sudden departure therefrom owing to bills unpaid, then cheap lodgings and visits to the pawnbroker, then appealing letters to old uncle, all of which were returned unopened. Lastly, in the miserable tenement in Mulberry Street, we find them without sixpence, laughing in the face of starvation. What wonders will not youth and hope work? What horrible witches fly affrighted at its merry laugh, piercing as the clarion of the cock? Midas should have been the god of youth, for he turned everything to gold. After a pause in the merry talk of this young couple, which I took advantage of in order to relate all I knew of their history, Dick said suddenly, as if the conviction forced itself on him for the first time, "Do you know, Agnes, that I feel absolutely hungry?" "No, do you, though?" said Agnes, with the most comic air of surprise. "Let us hasten up dinner." "Certainly," answered Dick, falling instinctively in with her humor. "This cook of ours is confoundedly slow today. I shall give her a warning." And he made a feint of looking at his watch. "I will ring the bell and tell John to hurry her," said Agnes, pulling an imaginary bell-rope. "John," she continued after a pause sufficient to allow the mythical John to mount the stairs, "John, tell the cook to send up the dinner instantly. Master is very angry at the delay."
"Yes, mum,"
replied a gruff voice, which Agnes, of course, did not affect to consider as proceeding from the bottom of Dick's chest. Then Agnes and her husband talked of indifferent matters for a moment or two, as if beguiling the weary time before dinner. After a proper period of delay, John's gruff voice announced dinner in the same mysterious manner as before. Then Dick made a great show of giving Agnes his arm and leading her in state into the dining-room. This solemn procession, however, consisted in marching round the naked chamber a couple of times and bringing up before the old deal table, which was supposed to be loaded with all the delicacies of the season. Dick was agreeably surprised at the splendor of the repast. "What!" he exclaimed, seating himself on the old wine-box and glancing over the bare table. "What a sumptuous feast! I shall enjoy it. My appetite is splendid. John, remove the cover from the soup. This is potage à la reine, my dear. Excellent, if I may judge by the odor. Shall I send you some?"
"Thank you, dear," answered Agnes, receiving a suppositious soup plate from the mythical John. "It is delicious, but oh, I do declare I've burned my mouth. It is so hot." And Agnes went through all the spasms of a person suffering from a spoonful of hot soup.
"As I live, a salmon!" exclaimed Dick, starting into an attitude of surprise. "It is early in the season for such fish."
"It was sent from Scotland in ice," replied Agnes.
"It is a noble animal," said Dick, using an aerial fish-knife with wonderful dexterity. "There is no sport more magnificent than that of salmon fishing, particularly on the Scotch and Irish rivers. The noble scenery, the rapid river, the long lithe rod, the whizzing line that drops the gorgeous fly into the deep pool where the silver-sided rascals lurk. Then the strike, the quick whirring of the wheel, the flashing leaps of the captive, the moments of agony when the line slackens as he runs upstream, the joy when he pulls again, the breathless anxiety when the gaff is thrust under him as he swims, the deep sigh of relief when he is hauled, flapping, shining, bleeding, dying into the boat. All this is—"
"Very eloquent, no doubt," says Agnes. "But your salmon is cooling all this time, my dear husband."
"Ah, true!" cries Dick with a sudden start, and applying himself with instant vigor to the discussion of a supposed cut of rosy flesh, with mealy flakes of white lying in the crevices of the meat. "What a delicious salmon! We are indebted to our noble friend in Scotland."
"You will find this turbot de volaille aux truffes very excellent," said Agnes, peering with the air of a connoisseur at the ideal dish before her. "Francois's last master says that he is celebrated for it."
We will see," muttered Dick, pursing up his lips and leaning back as far as he could on the wine-box, with a critical importance. "Good heavens, Agnes!" he exclaimed the moment after with an air of horror. "How could you recommend this? Why, the fellow has not put a single coxcomb in it. Pshaw! Here, John, take this away, and tell Francois if he sends up a dish of that kind again, I will condemn him to eat it."
"Fortunately, there are some delicious côtelettes à la financière left, so we can dispense with the volaille," said Agnes.
"They are indeed excellent," answers Dick, making believe that his mouth is full of the succulent meat of the côtelette. So on through the whole of this strange repast. Delicacy after delicacy was announced. Some relished, others criticized, more dismissed indignantly. The unlucky Francois came in for many severe rebukes, transmitted through the mythical John. The game was pronounced overdone, and an English pheasant, a present from an illustrious British friend, was condemned as having been utterly spoiled in the dressing. The dessert, however, consisted of a soufflé and a delicious confection called gâteau égyptien, was solemnly pronounced to be perfect, and John was commissioned to convey a flattering compliment to Francois, as a salve for the rebukes given during the previous courses. Two children playing at feasting could not have conducted this visionary repast more earnestly. The correct wines were drunk at the correct moment, and all the little ceremonies of a formal diner scrupulously performed. When all was over, when the coffee had been served and drunk, when the table had been cleared away, and John had respectfully retired, the eyes of the young couple met, and a flash of laughter sprang from the encounter. Casting aside the elegant formality of the great lady en grande tenue, Agnes ran to her husband, and clasping him round the neck, fairly sobbed out her laughter on his breast. "Do you know, dear," said Dick after a little while, "it may entail on me the reputation of being a glutton, of having a wolf in my stomach, of being a vampire, or 1,000 other unpleasant reports, but I nevertheless cannot help confessing that I feel rather more hungry than I did before I commenced that exquisite dinner,
which, in spite of some failures, does Francois infinite credit.
"Would you like to dine over again, Dick?" inquired his wife with a grave air. "Nothing is easier, you know."
"Certainly," answered Dick dubiously. "Nothing is easier, but I'm rather afraid that my tastes are becoming somewhat coarse. I am really ashamed of the very idea, but the fact is that at this very moment I have an intense longing for a piece of roast beef."
"That is singular," said Agnes with an air of surprise. "However, nature sometimes avenges itself on luxury by afflicting her votaries with homely tastes. I really pity you, Dick. For my part, nothing less delicate than a reed bird, tender, succulent, melting. An epitome, in fact, of perfume, nourishment, and flavor. Nothing less than this could possibly tempt my pampered appetite."
"I declare, Agnes," cried Dick, "I have a fancy just now to behave like a poor devil who hasn't got a penny. Yes, you may shrug your shoulders, but I really wish to divest myself of my splendor, and commit an act that contradicts the magnificence with which we are surrounded."
"Explain yourself."
"You remember that magnificent edition of Erasmus which my old friend Harry Waters gave me when I was going abroad? Well, I cherish that book dearly for the sake of him, and the few affectionate lines he has written on the flyleaf. Now, if a very poor man had that book, he would sell it, if he had nothing else to dispose of, for it is clasped with silver and is worth something. So I, who wish merely for a freak to experience the sensations of a poor man, have an idea of going out and selling that book, merely for the sake of the illusion, you know. Nothing more, on my honor."
"You always had queer fancies, dear," answered Agnes, as unconcernedly as if she had millions in her purse. But one might see beneath all that careless gaiety a sudden flash of hope sparkle for an instant. One could see very plainly that this book, which doubtless had till then been forgotten, gave her a new lease of life. One could see very plainly how bravely she had been smiling in the face of hunger and of death.
"Let me perform the last act of the millionaire before I play the part of a beggar," said Dick, rising joyously from his wine-box. "Sardanapalus burned his furniture. Why should I not consume my chairs? The fire is going out in a most unaccountable manner. Let us see how this fauteuil will blaze." So saying, he broke the wine-box into fragments and cast it into the almost fireless grate. The wine-box blazed. A lofty, ruddy flame sprang up in the fireplace, and shed a glow over the cold, naked room. It seemed as if the purple burgundy that once had lain between these few boards had left some portion of its fiery heart behind it. Who knows but that a bottle of that glowing wine was at that very moment sparkling on some splendid table? That in some other hemisphere the curtains were drawn close, and the wax lights blazing, and a party of jolly fellows with legs well stretched under the shining mahogany were toasting beautiful women, while the case which held the precious juice they were quaffing, the shell from which the soul that they were inhaling had fled, was burning in a rusty grate, and making a bonfire to scare away the werewolf, Death.
"The blaze is really quite cheerful," said Agnes, warming her hands while a faint glow of pleasure spread itself over her face. "Do you know that I think a wood fire preferable to all others?"
"It recalls the feudal times," answered Dick. "We are in a vast baronial hall. The roof is solid, with ribs of blackened oak, and antlers hang from the walls, to each horn of which cling 1,000 memories of the chase. The floor is of solid stone. Old tattered banners droop from the walls, and wave heavily as if too weak with age to shake off the thickening dust that soils their historic splendor. No modern garments shroud our limbs. You, dearest, are clad in a lustrous cramoisi velvet, with peaked stomacher and stately train sweeping on the ground. A cavalier's hat with its trailing feather droops over my temples. My sword clings against the pavement, and I assume a picturesque and haughty attitude as I stand with my back to the wide fireplace, where huge logs of oak, supported by iron dogs, spit and blaze, and send streams of sparkles up the huge chimney. I am at present meditating whether Hubert the seneschal shall be beheaded or not. Shall I order his instant execution, or—"
"Sell the book?" interrupted Agnes. "Please yourself."
"By Jove, I forgot," said Dick, forgetting in a moment all his splendor and feudality. "Agnes, I'll be back in 5 minutes. Tell John to prepare tea, and let us have the Sèvres service." And he bolted down the crazy stairs, reaching the bottom in a few bounds. Agnes smiled sorrowfully as she crouched over the rapidly sinking fire. The wine-box was fast losing its fiery spirit,
and degenerating into a dull mass of blackening embers. Now that her joyous young husband was away, she had no one with whom she could laugh at misery. It takes two to fight that crawling, cruel monster. The moment the echoes of Dick's footsteps had died away, the horror laid its cold hand upon her heart. It was in vain that she'd tried to sing, to laugh, to conjure up those comical visions which she and Dick had used so often before as an exorcism. She felt a black wall, as it were, closing gradually round her. The air became too thick to breathe. The last bit of sky was gradually being shut off. Then a quick foot on the stairs, a merry cricket-like voice, a half-sung carol, and Dick burst into the room performing a species of triumphal dance. A piece of paper fluttered in his hand. $2, he cried, executing an indescribable figure. Going for $2, this splendid, magnificent, delicious, succulent book with silver facings like a militia officer going for $2. Who'll bid? Only $2 gone at $2.
You don't mean to say,
said Agnes, rising eagerly. I do. I absolutely got $2 for the book. 'Twas worth 15, but then you know we must not be too nice. Isn't it splendid? And he waved the $2 bill as a young ensign waves his standard in the battle. I brought it home, Agnes dear, because I think you are the best person to spend it. These wretches of tradespeople would certainly cheat me if I attempted to buy any eatables. What shall it be?
What do you think of sausages?
Said Agnes, suggesting rather timidly.
They are cheap and—
Excellent! Cried Dick with a new pirouette. Charming! I adore the sausage. Sausage with some nice white bread, a pat of butter, and a few apples, and we shall feast in dazzling splendor.
Not forgetting a cigar for Dick? Whispered Agnes, looking up lovingly in his face. I know that you long for a cigar.
Angel! Cried Dick, clasping her in his arms and waltzing round the room with her. There are no soundings to the depths of a woman's love.
I'm off to the market, love,
said Agnes, giving him a kiss. But this chaste salute was suddenly interrupted by a knock at the door. Both hearts leaped. Who could it be? A new misfortune? The bookseller where Dick sold the book seemed suspicious about his being in possession of such property. Heaven grant that nothing unpleasant threatened, was the prayer of the young couple. Does Mr. Burdoon live here? Said a very deep, gruff voice. Yes, said Dick boldly. Come in. A short, thick-set man in a great coat entered and stood near the door. It was a dusky twilight in the room. The Assyrian bonfire of the wine-box had just expired in a few convulsive sparkles, and it was in vain that Dick tried to see the stranger's countenance. Are you Mr. Burdoon? Asked the visitor. I am, answered Dick. What is your business, sir? I would ask you to be seated, but unfortunately all my furniture is packed up. Never mind, answered the man gruffly. You sold a book a short time since at Mr. Marvell's bookstore, did you not? I really am not aware, sir, said Dick haughtily, that this is any one's business but my own. Softly, softly, my friend, answered the newcomer. No need of quarreling. How did that book come into your possession? Are you a police officer? Inquired Dick in a menacing tone. Never mind, said the man. Answer my question first. When I have answered it, I shall kick you downstairs, my friend. I'll run the risk, said the fellow with a short laugh. Well, then, it was given to me by a friend, answered Dick, making an ominous step toward the intruder. Wait a moment. Don't kick me down the stairs just yet. Why did you part with that book? Curse you, that's none of your business, cried Dick savagely. If you value your bones, you'll leave me. I don't value my bones, so I'll stay until you have answered me, said the man very quietly. Dick could not help smiling at this audacity. Every question I answer, said he, I shall give you an additional kick for. You know the terms, ask away. Why did you part with that book? Because I was starving. Because I saw my wife fainting and dying of cold and hunger before my eyes, all the time with a brave smile upon her lips. Because I have sought for work and could not get it. Because there was neither food nor fire nor furniture in this wretched hole. Because starvation was flapping his wings like a vulture, hoping each moment to plunge his beak into our vitals. For these reasons I sold the book that dear old Harry Waters gave me, and for none other would I have profaned his gift. Now I have exposed my misery to you, sir, whoever you are, and you shall pay dearly for it. I will break every bone in your body. And he sprang like a tiger at the short, thick-set man who stood in the gloom. He felt himself suddenly seized by the shoulder and rooted to the earth as if he had been in the grip of an enormous vice. Dick Burdoon, said the thick-set man, and this time his voice was sweet and soft as a woman's. "You are not going to kick me, Dick Burdoon. For many a starlit night in the silent fields you have lain with my arms around you and your head upon my bosom, while we talked of the splendid things we would achieve when we two went out into life hand in hand." Dick trembled like a leaf and said not a word. "You will not kick me, Dick Burdoon," went on the thick-set man, loosening his grasp of Dick's shoulder and drawing closer as he spoke, "because one day when the sun was pitiless and the river cool, a young weak boy, tempted by the clear waters, ventured into a deep part and went down, and then his friend, older and stronger than himself, plunged in, determined to rescue that fair boy or perish with him. And he dived into the deep waters twice, and the second time he found him, clasped in the meshes of loathsome weeds, with the merciless river sweeping away his young life. The elder boy struggled with him to land, and when they reached the shore people could scarce tell the saver from the saved. But when both recovered their strength and speech, the younger boy swore eternal gratitude to his preserver, and they vowed to be friends for evermore." "I remember! Cried Dick sobbingly. "Since that time," continued the thick-set man, "their paths in life have lain asunder, but I know that in the hearts of both old friendship lives still, and that if one of the twain were frowned on by the world, the other would pour out his life in smiles to make it sunshine with him again. That is why I know that you will not kick me, Dick Burdoon." "Harry Waters? My dear, dear old boy!" cried Dick through his tears, and flinging himself into the visitor's arms. "God bless you for coming, Harry, for I needed you sorely." "I saw you, my boy," said Harry, folding him in an embrace so gentle that one would imagine he was fondling a child. "I saw you the moment you entered the shop. You know I was always famous for poking in old bookstores, and I'm glad I have such tastes. I saw you selling the old Erasmus, my boy, and knew that something must be wrong with you. I followed you here, and now we three are joined, thank God, for a long time to come." And the kind fellow took poor timid Agnes's hand, and drew her close, till all three were united in one fond trinity of love. Need I tell how Harry Waters, the rich bachelor, carried Agnes and Dick off that evening to his house, and made much of them there? Need I say how they lived with him until Dick got employment, from which he has gradually raised himself to be a great merchant? Need I tell you about that solemn christening, whereat Dick's firstborn was named, with much ceremony, Harry Waters Burdoon? A hint of all those happy days will, I am sure, be enough for the warm-hearted reader, who has long since, I know, wished the young couple a full meal. One thing I must relate, however, an incident that occurred on the evening after the sale of the Erasmus. When the sobbings and the embraces were all over, Harry Waters, by way of saying something general, said to Dick, "By the way, have you dined yet?" Dick turned to his wife, who smiled. "Oh, yes, we dined sumptuously an hour ago," said Dick. "Ah, indeed," said Harry, rather surprised. "Yes, we dined with Duke Humphrey." End of section 11. Section 12. Of the Diamond Lens with Other Stories by Fitz-James O'Brien. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Millie Dove. 1. It was the quaintest of imaginable rooms. It was deep and dark in the corners, where the very spirit of mystery itself seemed to hide away, while there lay from end to end of the crazy old floor a long bar of golden light that had poured in through the single window, seeming like a luminous pathway which, if followed, would take one straight out through the diamonded casement, and so on to heaven. The walls were dim and deeply paneled with some dark melancholy wood, and in the chinks of every panel active spiders lived a toilsome life, passing their days in the construction of suspension bridges from their houses to the ceiling, which works were apparently undertaken from a purely scientific motive, as they were never seen to traverse them after they were finished. 3 chairs lurked in the corners of this half-lit chamber. One of them, old-fashioned, with a high back and crooked arms, seemed to repose in the twilight of the place, like some high-shouldered old beau of the last century, silently reflecting, as it were, on the habits of the present generation. This old fellow was not, however, always in retreat. He was many a time during the day dragged forth into the center of the stream of golden light that poured through the deep window, where he seemed to blink and shrink from the unwonted glare,
while a small bright figure nestled into his comfortable angles and pierced his bent and padded old arms with cruel pins, to which divers endless cotton threads were fastened. And then, as the sunlight poured splendidly through the diamond panes, powdering the air with golden dust and playing on the carvings of the ceiling, there was not a prettier picture in the world, not even in your grand foreign galleries beyond the sea, than Millie Dove, sitting in her sumptuous old chair. She was very, very pretty, this little Millie Dove. Her eyes were so dark and blue, and the light that shone in them seemed to be so far off behind, that one saw it shining miles and miles away, like the lights of a distant city across the sea. Then her hair was of such a rich brown, golden-hued where the light struck it, and her rosy, cloven mouth was so fresh and dewy that, if I were a painter, I would not have tried to paint Millie Dove for the world. I would only have dreamed of her. Millie sat for the greater part of the day in that high-backed chair, right in the sunny stream, working at her embroidery or knitting. I said before, prettily enough too, I think, that the light, as it poured in, seemed like a path to heaven. If it were so, who that saw this little maiden seated in its radiance would not say that she was an angel made to tread it? She did not tread it, however, or even dream of any such proceeding as marching out through the window on a pavement of sunbeams and wandering off into problematical regions. Not that Millie Dove did not wish to go to heaven, but she had so many things to do down below here that she never would have thought of such a journey unless it pleased God to take her. She had much to do, that little thing, though you would not think it to look at her. Millie Dove kept a shop. Yes, absolutely kept a shop, directly opposite to that old-fashioned window which lit the little room. A small glass door stood always half open, through which one could catch a glimpse of a small counter and small shelves, and a varied assortment of the smallest merchandise it was possible to keep. Tiny drums for infants of a military turn of mind, scanty bundles of cotton and muslin stuffs, large enough, perhaps, to furnish dolls' dresses, infinitesimal brooches, ridiculously reduced thimbles, stunted whips, dwarf rakes and spades, and baby wheelbarrows, together with 100 such-like articles, useful or ornamental, lay on the shelves, were hidden away in secret places under the counter, or depended in bunches from the low ceiling. It seemed exceedingly odd to be obliged to regard Millie Dove as the owner of all this magnificent and varied property. Her childish figure had nothing of the rigidity of a proprietor. She did not look as if she had any pockets to keep her money in, nor did she possess in the faintest degree the air of being arithmetical. No one would believe, to look into those clear, unworldly eyes, that she could buy or sell anything to the slightest advantage, unless indeed it were eggs, that commodity having been, as everyone knows who had read storybooks, entrusted from time immemorial to pretty little girls to convey to the market. Now, in spite of all this, Millie Dove was a famous hand at a bargain. It was excellent to see her standing behind her small counter, insisting pertinaciously on the price of some article which she was selling, explaining with much gravity to the cunning clown who wished to purchase its various merits and positive value, declaring that if she gave it a cent cheaper it would be a dead loss to her. And how were folks to live if they did not make some profit on their goods? Then all this with such a sweet and gentle firmness, such a mixture of innocence and shrewdness, that it must be a hard customer indeed who could find the heart to beat her down. That house, a small old-fashioned New England tenement, smelling of the Mayflower, together with the shop and its stock of goods, was all that Millie Dove possessed in this wide world. Her parents were dead, and this old roof with a scanty supply of merchandise was all they had to bequeath to their only child, and she managed her inheritance wonderfully well, let me tell you. By the aid of her little shop she made nearly $250 in the year, and she had a tenant for the upper part of the house, in the person of a Mr. Josiah Compton, who paid her probably as much more, so that this little proprietor of 16, although somewhat forlorn, was not very poor, and was able to lay something by every year in a savings bank at Boston. Mr. Josiah Compton was Millie's only friend. He was a gnarled bachelor of 56, odd, kind-hearted, passionately attached to flowers and music, and loving dearly everything old and quaint, and which did not smell, as he said, of the modern varnish. He had lived in this house a very long time. Indeed, he had been living there for many a year before Millie was born, and loved the place for the air of quiet antiquity with which it was haunted.
There was a curious old garden at the back of the house, which Mr. Josiah Compton had with his own hands brought to a high state of floral culture. He had labored at it for years and had written the history of his toil in flowers. The ground glowed with tulips and ranunculuses. Fiery lichnesses and rich blossomed roses flaunted in the deep borders. Trumpet honeysuckles thrust the golden lips of their horns through a tinted drapery of glossy leaves, as if about to sound a challenge to the blue convolvulus. Dahlias drunk with dew nodded to their heavy heads. The campanulas, with their bells of intense blue, grew in close ranks around the edges of the beds, like a tiny army guarding the borders of this kingdom of flowers. Color and perfume floated like a spell through the entire place. The brilliant plants, trained into no formality, sprang up to heaven with a splendid freedom. The walls were paved with the blossoms that they shed, and the heavens were fragrant with the odors that they breathed. On this garden Mr. Compton's window opened, and he would sit in the summer-time at his piano with the casement flung wide, the rich perfume of the flowers floating in upon the languid air, and the rich music he awakened surging over and under and through all, and mingling itself inextricably with the warm breath of the blossoming roses. Mr. Compton's playing, and he played beautifully, was a source of intense pleasure to Milly, as she sat in her old-fashioned parlor underneath and watched the shop through the half-open door. Poor child! Of music as an art she was profoundly ignorant. Dominants, subdominants, fifths and sevenths, intervals, contrapunta, and such like, were mysteries unknown to her by name. She had never heard any other performer than Mr. Compton, but those wild voluntaries that he played pleased her mightily. Those sad harmonious wailings that poured all day long through the open window until toward the close of day, when the sun was setting, they would burst into some triumphal melody that would sweep her soul up along the path of golden light striking heavenward, until it reached a goal so dazzlingly beautiful that she grew blinded with its glories. She was very happy sitting there in the sunshine, knitting and listening to the music. Occasionally some villager, in need of a ball of twine or a pair of scissors, would enter the shop, and then Milly, jumping nimbly from her perch, would glide behind the small counter, looking intensely businesslike. Or mayhap it would be some great boy who had just come into possession of wealth unlimited in the shape of $25, and who tremblingly entered Milly's little shop determined, yet scarce knowing how to spend it. And to all such Milly Dove was beautifully kind and patient, showing them with perfect good humor all the expensive toys to which they pointed, although perfectly aware all the time of the extent of their means, which were generally displayed in their hands with the most confiding simplicity. Her little sales over, she would again retreat to her parlor to knit, or, it may be, to take a good long peep at her panorama. Milly Dove had a panorama, not a panorama ever so many miles long, professing to exhibit the entire world in the most satisfactory manner possible in an hour and 25 minutes. No, Milly's panorama was, I must confess, limited in extent, but it possessed endless variety for her, and I do believe that she was never tired of looking at it. The panorama was by no means complicated. Its exhibition was not encumbered with huge pulleys and impossibly heavy weights and windlasses and cogwheels to keep it moving. But in spite of this insignificance when compared with a 7-mile mirror, Milly's panorama was for her a splendid pastime. It was an endless round of enjoyment, a garden of perpetual delights. This work of art consisted of a large wooden box, supported on 4 long, diverging, attenuated legs. It contained a few colored prints hung on hinges from the top, one hiding the other, each capable of being lifted into a horizontal position, so as to disclose the next picture in succession, by a series of little pulleys of a primitive character fixed on the exterior of the box. These pictures, when viewed through the double convex lens which was fixed in the front of the box at a proper focal distance, were magnified and glorified in so wonderful and splendid a manner that to Milly they presented the aspect of illimitable paintings, unsurpassable in beauty of design or brilliancy of color. How this treasure of art had come into her family the little maiden was altogether ignorant. Her mother was possessed of it long before Milly made her appearance in the world, and when dying had left no tradition of its history. The probability was that some wandering exhibitor may have left it with Mrs. Dove in pledge for unpaid board, and never redeemed it, poor fellow. But there it was, and when Milly was left alone in the world it became hers, and proud enough of it she was, I can assure you. It afforded the dear child wondrous delight to look through the peephole, and draw up the paintings one after the other,
She knew nothing of history. I don't like her a bit the less for that. And the subject of these splendid illustrations would have remained mysteries to her forever had it not been for the kindness of Mr. Compton, who would pull the strings as she peeped, and assuming the air and manner of a veritable showman, explain each cartoon as it appeared. That gentleman, however, was not always quite certain himself as to what scenes were really depicted in the splendid gallery. But then he never hesitated on account of any want of knowledge, but assigned to each picture the most probable explanation and title he could think of. I have seen many grand battle pieces in great galleries across the sea that might just as well have been called the Battle of Pavia as the Battle of Agincourt, and have looked at many a heathen goddess painted by some great old artist who might quite as well have been put down as Moll Flanders in the catalogue, and no one would have questioned the propriety of the title. So I do not blame Mr. Compton in the least for his impromptu style of nomenclature. It satisfied Milly perfectly, and he had no other object. These explanations did not, however, tax Mr. Compton's inventive faculties very largely. There were the pyramids of Giza, which he could not very well mistake, and which afforded him an opportunity of delivering a very learned discourse on the manners and customs of the ancient Egyptians, all carefully extracted from an encyclopedia. And there was the Battle of Waterloo, which the Duke of Wellington's nose and Napoleon's coat identified sufficiently. But again there arose a fiery painting with flames and soldiers and much killing, and falling horses with agonized mothers of large families in the fourth stories, which have no better name for it, Mr. Compton christened the Battle of Prague. And when he afterwards performed a piece of music of that name on the piano, and came to the part called by the composer in an explanatory note, "The Cries of the Wounded," there remained no shadow of a doubt on Milly's mind that the picture was indeed a faithful representation of that terrible combat, and that Mr. Compton was the best-informed historian in the world. Of late, somehow, Milly, poor child, was not quite so interested in her panorama, or so attentive to her shop as was her wont. She had not peeped through that magical hole for many days. Her knitting was, I regret to say, of an unusually spasmodic character. When she sat in the sunshine, it seemed almost too gay for her, and her pretty little face seemed to have a cloud of sadness covering it. But she welcomed the music with more pleasure than ever, and the more melancholy it was, the better she liked it, for it seemed then to speak to her in a language which she understood yet could not interpret, harmoniously talking of strange things which she thought she felt, and still was unable to comprehend. So she sat all day and listened to Mr. Compton's wild improvisations as they floated over the flowers, till perfume and harmony seemed to be mingling, and she grew so abstracted in her habits that she had to be called thrice by Mrs. Barbary, who wanted to buy a flower dredge before she thought of answering. It was singular, but no less true, that just at this time I had the privilege of peeping into that pure little maiden's mind, and observing in secret all its innocent little operations. It was a rare privilege, I know, but I hope I love honor, beauty, and virtue too much not to look upon the prerogative as holy. You will hear, therefore, from me only such things as are necessary to the conduct of the story I am endeavoring to relate. I saw at my very first peep what it was that induced Milly to forget her panorama, and pay such little heed to old Mrs. Barbary. The cause of all this distraction was a certain person of whom you shall know more before I have done with you. About a week previous to the time I am speaking of, a stranger had made his appearance in the little town of Blossomdale in which Milly lived, and just about the same time Milly, who had heard of the stranger's arrival, as one hears everything in a village, but had not seen him, observed a man of singular aspect passing her shop frequently. Coupling the two facts together, she came to the conclusion that this person and the strange arrival were one, which at least proves that Milly Dove was capable of inductive reasoning. He was a remarkable man, this stranger, not very tall, but rather powerfully built. He always walked rapidly, with his frame stooped forward from the hips, as if his mind were in advance of his body. His face was somewhat narrow and delicately featured. A thin mustache curled around a small mouth, and his hair was profuse, though not long. But it was in his eyes that his individuality chiefly resided, eyes that seemed to gaze at nothing and yet see everything. They did not look, they absorbed, those great dark eyes, and shed from out their own darkness a shadow over the whole face. They were eyes truly delightful to look at, as it is delightful to look down into a calm sea, and hard to be forgotten. Milly did not easily forget them, I promise you. They haunted her as she sat alone in the little half-lit parlor, and seemed to glow with a strange light in the dim corners
where the spiders dwelt. She looked at them, and they looked at her all the livelong day, and this was why she forgot her panorama. Now, Millie Dove told Mr. Compton everything. He was her only friend. He stood to her in the place of a parent and loved her as a daughter. Confidence existed between them as a matter of course, and she talked to him as the stream flows. So she soon told him about this stranger, how she had seen him, how his face haunted her continually, how she kept thinking about him all day long, how she watched for him at the hour when it was usual for him to pass her door, and felt a sort of dim, indistinct pleasure when he passed. All this she told her only friend simply, truly, naturally, without even the remotest idea of the nature or origin of her feelings. For Millie was at that happy age when people are not learned in the mysteries of themselves, and do not possess the mournful knowledge which enables them to anatomize their own hearts. Mr. Compton at first looked rather sad at hearing this naive confession, but after a moment he laughed and kissed her fair forehead, saying that she would soon forget this wonderful stranger. Then he sat down at his piano, and played so wildly and wonderfully a strain fraught with such depths of pure and unconscious passion that Millie lay statue-like near him, and dreamed so perfectly that she dreamed no more. 2. It was a pleasant June day. Through the open window in Millie's little room a mingled stream of sunshine and the breath of flowers rolled in, filling the chamber with light and perfume. The spiders dozed in the crevices of the paneled walls, while their aerial webs shone like delicate threads of silver. The high-shouldered chairs sidled off into the corners as if they were ashamed of their age, and the great panorama, which stood on one side of the door, glared with its huge eye-like lens at the great window like a species of four-legged cyclops. Millie, as usual, was sitting in the sun, nestled into that great high-backed chair which was a world too large for her. She worked absently at some intricate feminine fabric. A fabric it was that I believe would have driven me crazy if I'd been set down to learn its mysteries. There were dozens of strings pinned to various portions of the unhappy old chair. More strings trailed on the floor, whose courses, if followed, would be found to terminate in numberless little balls that kept continually rolling off into the corners and disturbing the spiders that lived on the first floors of the panels. Then each string had to be unpinned every second minute and juggled with after some wondrous fashion until, having been thrust by a species of magic known only to Millie through an interminable perspective of loops, it was solemnly repinned to the chair, and then the whole process began again. Whether it was owing to the complication of this terrible web or to the preoccupation of her own thoughts, no Penelope ever made so many blunders as Millie Dove on that June morning. Every now and then the web would come to a sudden standstill. A minute investigation of certain curious knots would result in the discovery of some heart-rending error. Then the vagrant balls would have to be hunted up in the corners, and the pin would have to come out, and with a pettish toss of the head and a little pouting of the underlip, the child would tediously unravel all the false work and begin again. Sometimes she would let it drop altogether, and gaze absently through the open windows, as if she were watching the hummingbirds that hung before the golden-lipped tubes of the trumpet honeysuckle, or she would turn toward the desolate panorama that seemed to gaze reproachfully at her with its single eye, and ponder over the propriety of taking another peep at that bloody battle of Prague, or the extraordinary representation of the Israelites gathering the manna in the desert, which said manna seemed to have been made into very respectable and well-baked quartern loaves before it fell. Millie's reveries, whatever they were interrupted by the entrance of Master Dick Bobby, the eldest son of Judge Bobby, who was the richest and greatest man in the village. Master Bobby had acquired, probably by inheritance, the sum of $50, and immediately upon coming into possession of his property had set off for Millie's shop, uncertain as to whether he would purchase her entire stock or simply confine himself to the acquisition of a stick of molasses candy. Millie, with her pleasant smile, was behind the counter in an instant, awaiting the commands of the young squire.
"What's them guns apiece, Miss Millie?" inquired Master Bobby, pointing to a couple of flimsy fowling pieces that stood in the corner. $6 apiece, sir." "I guess you'd take half price for 'em if a body was to buy both," said the young millionaire half inquiringly, as if he had only to put his hand in his pocket and pull out the money.
"Well," said Millie, "I didn't buy them. They were here when Father died, and as they've been so long in my hands, I'd be glad to sell them cheap."
You can have them both for $7.50 if you want them, Master Dick. Oh, I don't want them. Only Father might, if his own gun was to burst. What's the price of them skates, Miss Millie? $1.50, sir. They are capital skates and came all the way from New York. But what do you want of skates this weather, Master Dick? Oh, I didn't know, but I might lose my own skates next winter, so I thought I'd ask. Are you going to the circus show this evening, Miss Millie? For if you'd like to go, I can get tickets from Father, and I'll take you. And Master Dick looked admiringly at the pretty little maiden. Thank you kindly, sir, but I don't think Mr. Compton would like me to go. He says the circus is a bad place. He don't know nothing, answered Master Dick surlily. But if you won't go, I know one who will. Give me an ounce of molasses candy and half an ounce of peppermint, Miss Millie. Millie had just opened the drawer containing the confections demanded by Master Dick, and was about measuring out the required quantity of molasses and peppermint, when she saw something through the window that made her suddenly stop. A gentleman was marching slowly down the street. He appeared to be lost in reverie, for his head was thrown back, and his eyes were fixed on vacancy, while he moved on apparently unconscious of the existence of everybody, himself included. He was a pleasant gentleman, too, and seemed to be occupied with pleasing thoughts, for a sort of half-born smile played around his thin lips, seeming always on the point of becoming a laugh, but never fulfilling its promise. This gentleman had just arrived opposite to Millie's door when his reverie was suddenly and most unexpectedly interrupted by a big stone. This big stone was a stone of infamous habits. It lurked under a specious coating of clay, seemingly soft and elastic in its nature, but all the while turning up one sharp and treacherous edge that to the foot of the tight-booted and unwary pedestrian caused unutterable tortures. It was a Tartuffe among stones, hypocritical, velvety, inducing confidence, but woe to the toe that lit upon its venomous edge. Well, of course, this thoughtful gentleman marched straight upon this assassin of stone. Shoot! A terrible thud of toes against the treacherous edge, a wild flinging out of arms in a vain attempt at equilibrium, a convulsive ejaculation which I hope nobody heard, and our pedestrian measured his length in the dust. He rose in a moment, looked reproachfully at the stone as if to upbraid it for its misconduct, then, recalled probably by some unusual sensation, he looked down at his legs. Alas, across his left knee there was a great gaping split in his trousers, through which a wide vista of linen was visible. The poor gentleman gazed ruefully at this scene of destruction, looked round, and then again at his knee, then tried to walk a step or two, stopped, looked at his knee once more, and seemed to meditate profoundly on his position. While wrapped in this painful reverie, the victim of that abominable stone was startled by a very sweet little voice at his elbow. This voice, belonging to Millie Dove, said, "Please, sir, if you will step into the shop, I will mend it for you." The gentleman turned round, and gave a rapid glance at the sunny, girlish face that looked up into his with such a frank, easy expression, as if it was the most natural thing in the world that he should fall, and that she should come out and offer to mend his trousers. "Thank you, my child," said he simply. "I am very much obliged to you. What is your name?" "Millie Dove, sir." "And this is your father's shop, I suppose?" And the stranger glanced round as he entered with a half-smile at the varied assortment of goods that it contained. It was quite deserted, for Master Dick Bobby, left alone with the candy, had, I regret to say, helped himself and departed. "No, sir, it's mine," answered Millie, poking in her pocket for her needle-box. "Yours? Why, you are young to be at the head of an establishment." "I was 16 my last birthday, sir. Will you come into the inside room, if you please, so that you may put your foot upon a chair?" The stranger did as he was bidden, and Millie's nimble fingers were soon busily drawing together the jagged edges of that gaping rent in his injured trousers. He looked down upon her with a wondering gaze. "I suppose some of your relatives live with you here?" he said, after a pause during which he had been studying her features intently. "No, sir, I am alone." "Alone?" "No, that is, not exactly alone. Mr. Compton lodges upstairs." "Mr. Compton?" said the stranger, a sort of dark shadow falling across his face like a veil. "Who is Mr. Compton, a young man?" "A friend of my mother's, sir. He lives here all the year round, and is a dear, pleasant gentleman. He's quite young, too, not more than 56. "Ah!" And the knight of the rueful breeches seemed to breathe more freely.
That is young indeed. How long have you been keeping shop?"
2 years, sir. My mother died about that time, and the neighbors were all very good to me when I began. I think it will do now, sir."
Thanks, replied the stranger, scarce giving a glance at the neat seam across his knee. "You are an excellent little workwoman." And as he spoke, he seated himself deliberately in Milly's high-backed chair, much to that young lady's surprise. "You have a pretty room here," he continued, looking round him approvingly. "A very pretty room, the sunlight gushing in through that window, and parting, as it were, to make good its entrance, the honeysuckles that wave before it, has a charming effect. Is it you who take care of the flowers out there?"
"Oh, there's not much to do now," said Milly modestly. "Mr. Compton made the garden, and now I help him a little. They grow there so nicely, the flowers do. And in the spring I freshen up the beds a little, and weed the walks, and clip off the dead branches. And I think the sun and the rain do the rest."
That's prettily said." Poor Milly grew scarlet at the tone of easy assurance in which this approbation was uttered. This gentleman seemed to have an air of the world about him that somehow alarmed her. She knew not why. His walk, his way of speech, his manner, were all so different from those of the loutish villagers to whom she had been accustomed. He was even unlike Mr. Compton, who to Milly until then had been the highest type of human perfection. "I'd like to live in a room like this," muttered the stranger half aloud, gazing round him with evident pleasure. "It has a sweet, thoughtful air, and that garden outside would fill me with poetry. I'd like very much indeed to live here."
"Then why don't you come?"
was on the tip of Milly's tongue, but she suddenly recollected herself in time, and so was silent. "Do you ever read, Miss Milly Dove?" was the next question, as the visitor turned abruptly to the young maiden.
"No, yes, that is, sometimes,"
was the alarmed reply. "Which means that you do not read at all," said the stranger gravely. Milly looked as if she was immediately about to tuck the end of her little apron into her eyes and weep herself away. "Well," continued he, "that can be remedied, but Mr. Compton should have given you books."
"Sir,"
said Milly stoutly, quickly to espouse her friend's cause, though unable to defend her own.
"Sir, Mr. Compton knows a great deal more, in fact, than anyone I ever saw, and everything that he does is right."
The stranger laughed. "You are a chivalrous but illogical little maiden," said he, in a tone of insufferable patronage.
"I may not read much," said Milly, flushing up, "but I have a panorama."
"Oh, you have a panorama? A panorama of what? Let us see this wonder that supplies the place of books."
"Shall I show it to you, sir?"
asked Milly timidly. "Certainly. But before profiting by your kindness, I must introduce myself formally. I'm Mr. Alexander Winthrop, a poor gentleman with enough for his appetites and too little for his desires. I am fond of traveling, books, and thinking. I am only 25 years old, although I look 30. I live close to New York and am at present at Blossomdale on business. Now, you know all that I intend you to know about me, so we will go on with our panorama." This offhand introduction was delivered with such gravity that poor Milly did not know what to make of it. At first she thought he was laughing at her, but on looking at his eyes she could not detect the slightest twinkle of merriment. So she nodded her little head to Mr. Alexander Winthrop, as if to say, "All right, I know you," and then proceeded to introduce him to the panorama.
"This,"
said Milly in a solemn voice as she made him put his eye to the peephole and proceed to pull the strings that lifted the pictures.
"This is the invasion of Mexico by the Spaniards. The man in the big boat is Cortez, a very cruel man indeed, and the man on the shore is Montezuma, the king of Mexico, who may be known by his red skin."
Coughed Mr. Alexander. "How do you know that this is the invitation of Mexico?"
"Mr. Compton told me, sir."
"Oh, Mr. Compton told you. Then it's all right, of course. But," he continued, muttering to himself, "if Mr. Compton is right, Cortez dressed exceedingly like William Penn, and Montezuma would make a capital North American Indian."
"This picture," continued Milly, pulling another string, "represents the great pyramids of Egypt, built by various kings to serve for their tombs. The ancient Egyptians were far advanced in civilization, while the rest of the globe was plunged in the obscurity of ignorance. Their chief god was Osiris, and the priesthood was so powerful that the government, in truth, was an ecclesiastical one. The ancient Egyptians were in the habit of placing a skeleton at the head of the table when they feasted, for the purpose of reminding them of their mortality, and it is believed that from them first sprang the art of embalming bodies." They were highly commercial people, and found large markets for the products of their industry and art in the ancient cities of Greece and Rome.
"Why, child, where did you learn this?" exclaimed Mr. Alexander, gazing with astonishment on the little maiden, who ran off this farrago of learning with the glibness of a lecturer on ancient history, looking all the while exceedingly proud of her knowledge.
"Mr. Compton told me," she answered proudly.
Mr. Alexander could no longer contain himself, but burst into a shout of laughter that made Millie's ears tingle. Her round cheeks flushed, and the tears rose to her eyes. Poor little thing, she thought this Mr. Alexander Winthrop exceedingly rude, and yet she could not feel angry with him. "Well, what's the next picture?" he asked, as soon as he had recovered from his mirth and without making the slightest apology for his improper behavior.
"It's the Battle of the Nile," answered Millie, rather sullenly, for she did not exactly like the merciless laugh of her new friend.
"I was there all the while," chimed in Mr. Alexander.
"You couldn't. It happened ever so long ago," answered Millie quickly, delighted at finding Mr. Alexander out in a fib.
That gentleman was on the point of going off into another fit of merriment when a wild prelude on a piano wavered harmoniously through the window. After wandering up and down the keys for a short time, striking out fragments of melodies and fluttering uncertainly from one to the other, as a butterfly roams from bud to bud, not knowing which to choose, the performer at length struck on a theme that seemed to satisfy him, and then poured out his entire soul. That it was a voluntary one could discern in an instant, from the occasional irregularity of the rhythm and lack of proper sequence between the parts. But it was so wild, so original, so mournful, so full of broken utterances of passion, that one might have imagined it the wail of a lost angel outside the gates of that paradise which he saw but could not enjoy. "That is a great performer," said Mr. Alexander, rising. "I must go and see him."
"It's Mr. Compton," cried Millie eagerly. "He does not like to be disturbed. You must not go now."
"I don't care," said Mr. Alexander very coolly. "Where's the stairs? Oh, here. All right." And before she could detain him, he had bounded up the stairs and was gone. "I make no apology for coming in here in this way," said Mr. Alexander as he pushed open Mr. Compton's door, "because if you don't want people to rush in on you unannounced, you should not play so well, nor improvise such original themes."
"You are an artist, then?"
said Mr. Compton, rising in some surprise at this sudden intrusion.
"All such have a right to enter here."
"Enough of an artist to comprehend you," said the young man bluntly. "You are an artist, Mr. Compton, and have never done anything but toy with art. More shame for you."
"Who is my lecturer?" said Mr. Compton rather sternly.
"My name is Alexander Winthrop."
"What? He who—"
"Hush!" cried the young man, lifting his finger. For at that moment Millie appeared with flushed cheeks on the threshold of the door. "I am only Alexander Winthrop. I tore my trousers by a fall opposite to this house. This little fairy," pointing to Millie, "mended them for me. I heard you playing. I ran upstairs. Now you know all about me."
"Then you must be the stranger of whom Millie has so often spoke to me, as passing the door every day,"
said Mr. Compton, with a bland ignorance of the incautiousness of his remark, and totally heedless of Millie's agonized telegraphings to make him stop. "Oh, then, the little fairy knew me before!" exclaimed Mr. Alexander eagerly. "So we were old acquaintances, Miss Millie." Millie said nothing, but appeared to have suddenly remembered that her shop had been left unprotected, and disappeared as if by magic. "I want to have a talk with you, Mr. Compton," said Mr. Alexander, looking after her. Mr. Compton sighed.
"Let us go into the garden,"
he said, and they went out together. 3. 2 months after this, Millie Dove sat in her little room reading. Those wondrous fabrics on which she used to labor with such patience were gone. There was dust on the panorama. Its single eye was dim and melancholy. No more balls disturbed the repose of the fat old spiders in the panels. The very shop itself seemed to have an uncared-for look. The reason of all this was that Millie Dove had become a student, a hard, close, unwearying student, and the books that she read were given to her by Mr. Alexander. One author in particular pleased her mightily. A man named Ivan Thorel had lately astonished the world with an alternate succession of works of philosophy and fiction. In both paths did he seem to be equally at home. His novels were tender, impassioned, truthful, and always breathing the sublimest scorn for everything mean and unholy.
His philosophy was still more wonderful, because it was so clear. The progress of man was always his theme. The gradual amalgamation of races, the universal equalization of climate from the cultivation of the entire globe, the disappearance of poverty from the earth before the influence of machinery, which labored for all, the consequent improvement of the physical condition of our race, the abolishment of crime, in short, the apogee of the world. On all this he expatiated with a profundity of thought and simplicity of expression that made him at once the deepest and clearest of writers. Ivan Thorel then opened a new world for Milly. For the first time she comprehended the true beauty of life, and experienced those delicious sensations which one experiences when beginning to observe an epoch, let me tell you, that comes much later than one imagines. Thus a trinity of genius and goodness reigned supreme in Milly Dove's little heart, Mr. Compton, Mr. Alexander, and Ivan Thorel. And although her reason placed Mr. Compton first as being the oldest friend and Ivan Thorel next as being the greatest genius, yet I doubt much if that little maiden's heart did not put Mr. Alexander Winthrop, her affianced lover, high above all. There was one thing that grieved this dear child, and it was so strange a grief for her to have had at that period that it seemed a mystery to me how she ever could have had it. It was that Mr. Alexander was not a great writer. She loved him very dearly, and she knew that Mr. Compton loved him, and they talked very learnedly together for hours at a time. He was very clever, this Mr. Alexander Winthrop. But oh, if he would only write books like Ivan Thorel! If he would create those dear stories, so pure, so good, and so true! If he would make those splendid books that made everyone love his fellow men better when he had read them, and which were so purely written that a child might understand them. If he would only do this, she told him many times, as she clung to his breast, she would be as happy as the hummingbirds that lived outside, forever in the sunshine. And Mr. Alexander would stroke her brown hair, and kiss her white forehead, and smiling mysteriously say, "Some time, perhaps." But he did not write books, and Milly Dove was sad. Her sadness was now, however, for the moment lost in the perusal of Ivan Thorel's last book, The Ladder of Stars, a strange mixture of romance and philosophy, and Milly pored over it in her high-backed chair while the hummingbirds outside looked in at her with their sharp, cunning eyes, and said to themselves as they saw her rosy lips, "Bless us, where there are flowers there must be loads of honey. Let us go in and get it." But now and then these rosy flowers had a strange way of opening with a laughing sound, and showing rows of white seed inside, in a manner unlike any flower ever before seen, so that the hummingbirds thought they might be dangerous flowers and did not go in. Milly was reading one of the most beautiful passages in The Ladder of Stars when she heard a step behind her. She turned and beheld one of the most beautiful ladies she had ever seen standing in the doorway. A tall, proud-looking lady she was, with bright eyes and fierce lip, and the smallest hands in the world, and such dress, so rich and elegant and flowing. Milly thought she was a fairy. Being naturally polite, however, even to fairies, the little maiden rose and advanced timidly to this sultana. The lady did not keep her long in suspense. "Your name is Milly Dove?" she said in a commanding voice. "Yes, ma'am," said Milly, half frightened at the tone of the question. "You are going to marry a man calling himself Alexander Winthrop, is it not so?" "Yes, ma'am." Milly's limbs began to tremble at this point. "You must not marry him." "Why, ma'am?" Milly's strength began to come back a little. "Because he would make you unhappy." "How do you know, ma'am?" "Oh, Milly Dove, where did you pick up the Socratic mode of reasoning?" "Because I know it," said the sultana, stamping her foot. "You cannot marry him. He loves me. I know he does," she continued passionately. "He loves me better," said Milly quietly. "I know it, for he told me so." "You love you better! Listen, child, you do not know this man. He is proud, wealthy, learned, a genius, and courted by all the world. His sphere in life rolls through another orbit than yours. His genius, his tastes, his friendships will all separate him from you. He thinks he loves you now. Well, in 3 months he will be disenchanted. He will neglect you, ill-treat you perhaps, laugh at your ill-breeding, sport with your ignorance, and break your heart. Be warned in time. Here, I am rich. You shall have money, as much money as you wish, if you fly this place and promise never to see Alexander Winthrop again. I will make you wealthy, happy, everything you wish, only leave me my love. Leave me my love." She held out a purse to Milly as she spoke, and her splendid form literally shook with passion. Poor Milly was thunderstruck. She knew not what to do. Oh, how she wished for either Alexander or Mr. Compton. "Ma'am," said she at last, "I do not want money. I never knew that Mr. Alexander was rich, but it makes no matter to me whether he is or not. I know he loves me, for he said so, and he never tells a lie. Therefore I cannot do as you wish me. I am sorry, ma'am, that you should love Mr. Alexander too." "But you must! I tell you, you must, girl. You shall not wed him. He is mine. Do you not know—" "She does not know, Miss Helen Durham," said Mr. Alexander himself, stepping at this juncture out of the shop and putting his arm round Milly's waist. "Oh, you are here, sir," said Miss Durham, with a scornful curl of her upper lip, "enjoying love in a cottage, which no doubt you taste merely as a literary experience to be made serviceable in your next book. It is a pretty idyll." "Madam," said Alexander, "let me hear no unworthy sneers against a love so pure that you could not understand it. Milly, as this lady has thought fit to intrude herself on my privacy and yours, it is fit that you should learn the history of our association." "Tell it, sir, by all means," said Miss Durham, seating herself in a chair. "You are accustomed to weave romances." "I tell the truth, madam, always." Adam, back to your town luxury and refined atmosphere, where pretty names are given to bad deeds. I wish to remain unmolested with that pure love which will ever be a mystery to you. Go!" "What name did she call you?" cried Milly Dove breathlessly, as the proud lady swept scornfully out through the little shop. "Milly, you may now know what I have long concealed. I am Ivan Thorall." "You? You? Oh, I am so glad, so glad, so glad! Dear Alexander, I have now nothing to wish for." "But I have, dear Milly." Those who have read Alexander Winthrop's latest and best novel, The Village Bride, will see there how happily he and Milly and Mr. Compton lived together, and they will recognize in the lecturer on women's rights the portrait of Miss Durham. End of section 12. Section 13 of The Diamond Lens with Other Stories by Fitz-James O'Brien. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Dragon Fang Possessed by the Conjurer Pao Lu. Chapter of the Miraculous Dragon Fang.
as it was principally of small traders, barbers, porcelain tinkers, and country people, gazed with open mouths upon the conjurer, who, clad in a radiant garment of many colors, strutted proudly up and down his temporary stage.
"What is a Dragon Fang, ingenious and well-educated conjurer?"
at last inquired Wei Cheng-zhe, a solemn-looking mandarin of the third class, who was adorned with a sapphire button and one-eyed peacock's feather.
"What is a Dragon Fang?" "Is it possible," asked Paolu, "that the wise and illustrious son of virtue, the Mandarin Wei Cheng-zhe, does not know what a Dragon Fang is?"
And the conjurer pricked up his ears at the mandarin as a hare at a barking dog.
Of course,
said the mandarin Wei Cheng-zhe, looking rather ashamed of his having betrayed such ignorance.
"One does not pass his examinations for nothing. I merely wish that you should explain to those ignorant people here what a Dragon Fang is. That was why I asked."
"I thought that the soul of wisdom must have known," said Paolu triumphantly, looking as if he believed firmly in the knowledge of Wei Cheng-zhe. "The noble commands of Wei Cheng-zhe shall be obeyed. You all know," said he, looking round upon the people, "that there are 3 great and powerful that sounded like the roll of a copper drum amidst the hills. That disgraceful and well, said he, seating himself in my operating chair while 2 of his attendants fanned him. "Paolu, I have the toothache." "Does your lordship," said I, "wish that I should remove your noble and illustrious pain?" "You must draw my tooth," said he. "Woe to you if you draw the wrong one." "It is too much honor," I replied, "but I will make my abominable and ill-conducted instruments entice your lordship's beautiful tooth out of your high-born jaw with much rapidity." So I got my big pincers and my opium bottle and opened the strange mandarin's mouth. Ah, it was then that my low-born and despicable heart descended into my bowels. I should have dropped my pincers from sheer fright if they were not caught by their hooked ends in my wide sleeve. The mandarin's mouth was all on fire inside. As he breathed, the flames rolled up and down his throat like the flames that gather on the yellow grass plains in the season of much heat. His palate glowed like red-hot copper, and his tongue was like a brass stew-pan that had been on salt fire for 30 days. But it was his teeth that affrighted me most. They were a serpent's teeth. They were long and curved inward, and seemed to be made of transparent crystal, in the center of which small tongues of orange-colored fire leaped up and down out of some cavity in the gums. "Well, dilatory barber," said the mandarin in a horrible tone while I stood pale and trembling before him, "why don't you draw my tooth? Hasten, or I will have you sliced lengthwise and fried in the sun." "Oh, my lord," said I, terrified at this threat, "I fear that my vicious and unendurable pincers are not sufficiently strong." "Slave," answered he in a voice of thunder, "if you do not fulfill my desires, you will not see another moon rise." I saw that I should be killed anyway, so I might as well make the attempt. I made a dart with my pincers at the first tooth that came, closed them firmly on the crystal fang,
and began to pull with all my strength. The mandarin bellowed like an ox of Tibet. The flames rolled from his throat in such volumes that I thought they would singe my eyebrows. His 2 attendants and his 4 palanquin bearers put their arms round my waist to help me pull, and there we tugged for 3 or 4 minutes, until at last I heard a report as loud as 9,999 firecrackers. The attendants, the palanquin bearers, and myself all fell flat on the floor, and the crystal fang glittered between the jaws of the pincers. The mandarin was smiling pleasantly as I got up from the floor. "Paolu," said he, "you had a narrow escape. You have removed my toothache, but had you failed, you would have perished miserably. For I am the Dragon Lung who rules the sky and the heavenly bodies, and I am as powerful as I am wise. Take as a reward the Dragon Fang which you drew from my jaw. You will find it a magical charm with which you can work miracles, honor your parents, observe the rites, and live in peace." So saying, he breathed a whole cloud of fire and smoke from his throat that filled my poor and despicable mansion. The light dazzled and the smoke suffocated me. And when I recovered my sight and breath, the Dragon Lung, the attendants, the palanquin, and the 4 bearers had all departed. How and whither I knew not. Thus was it, elegant and refined people of Qingtao, that this small and evil-minded person who stands before you became possessed of the wonderful Dragon Fang, with which he can work miracles. This story, delivered as it was with much graceful and dramatic gesticulation, and a volubility that seemed almost supernatural, had its effect upon the crowd, and a poor little tailor named Hung Pu, who was known to be always in debt, was heard to say that he wished he had the Dragon Fang, wherewith to work miracles with his creditors. But the mandarins, blue, crystal, and gilt, smiled contemptuously and said to themselves, "We who are learned men know how to esteem these things." The Mandarin Wei Chang Ze, however, seemed to be of an inquiring disposition, and evinced a desire to continue his investigations. "Supremely visited conjurer," said he to Paolu, "your story is indeed wonderful. To have been visited by the Dragon Lung must have been truly refreshing and enchanting. Though not in the least doubting your marvelous relation, I am sure this virtuous assemblage would like to see some proof of the miraculous power of your Dragon Fang." The crowd gave an immediate assent to this sentiment by pressing closer to the platform on which Paolu strutted, and exclaimed with one voice, "The lofty mandarin says wisely, we would like to behold." Paolu did not seem in the slightest degree disconcerted. His narrow black eyes glistened like the dark edges of the seeds of the watermelon, and he looked haughtily around him. "Is there any one of you who would like to have a miracle performed, and of what nature?" he asked with a triumphant wave of his arms. "I would like to see my debts paid," murmured the little tailor Hung Pu. "Oh, Hung Pu," replied the conjurer, "this unworthy personage is not going to pay your debts. Go home and sit in your shop and drink no more rice wine, and your debts will be paid. For labor is the Dragon Fang that works miracles for idle tailors." There was a laugh through the crowd at this sally, because Hang Pu was well known to be fond of intoxicating drinks, and spent more of his time in the street than on his shopboard. "Would either of you like to be changed into a camel?" continued Paolu. "Say the word, and there shall not be a finer beast in all Tibet." No one, however, seemed to be particularly anxious to experience this transformation. Perhaps it was because it was warm weather and camels bear heavy burdens. "I will change the whole honorable assemblage into turkey buzzards, if it only agrees," continued the conjurer. "Or I will make the Lake Tung come up into the town in the shape of a watermelon, and then burst and overflow everything." "But we should all be drowned," exclaimed Hang Pu, who was cowardly as well as intemperate. "That's true," said Paolu. "But then you need not fear your creditors." And he gave such a dart of his long arm at the poor little tailor that the wretched man thought he was going to claw him up and change him into some frightful animal. "Well, since this illustrious assembly will not have turkey buzzards or camels, this weak-minded, ill-shapen personage must work a miracle on himself," said Paolu, descending from his platform into the street, and bringing with him a little 3-legged stool made of bamboo rods. The crowd retreated as he approached, and even the solemn Wei Cheng Ze seemed rather afraid of this miraculous conjurer. Paolu placed the bamboo stool firmly on the ground, and then mounted upon it. "Elegant and symmetrical bamboo stool," he he said, lifting his arms, and exhibiting something in his hand that seemed like a piece of polished jadestone. "Elegant and symmetrical bamboo stool. The justly despised conjurer named Paolu entreats that you will immediately grow tall in the name of the dragon Lung." Truly, the stool began to grow in the presence of the astonished crowd. The 3 legs of bamboo lengthened and lengthened with great rapidity, bearing Paolu high up into the air. As he ascended, he bowed gracefully to the open-mouthed assembly. "It is delightful," he cried. "The air up here is so fresh. I smell the tea-winds from Fu Qin. I can see the spot where the heavens and the earth cease to run parallel. I hear the gongs of Peking, and listen to the lowing of the herds in Tibet. Who would not have an elegant bamboo stool that knew how to grow?" By this time, Paolu had risen to an enormous height. The legs of the slender tripod on which he was mounted seemed like silkworm's threads, so thin were they compared with their length. The crowd began to tremble for Paolu. "Will he never stop?" said a mandarin with a gilt ball named Lin. "Oh, yes!" shouted Paolu from the dizzy height of his bamboo stool. "Oh, yes, this ugly little person will immediately stop. Elegant stool, the poor conjurer entreats you to stop growing. But he also begs that you will afford some satisfaction to this beautifying assemblage down below, who have honored you with their inspection." The bamboo stool, with the utmost complaisance, ceased to lengthen out its attenuated limbs. But on the moment experienced another change as terrifying to the crowd. The 3 legs began to approach each other rapidly, and before the eye could very well follow their motions, had blended mysteriously and inexplicably into one. The stool still retaining a miraculous equilibrium. Immediately this single stem began to thicken most marvelously, and instead of the dark shining skin of a bamboo stick, it seemed gradually to be encased in overlapping rings of a rough bark. Meanwhile a faint rustling noise continued overhead, and when the crowd, attracted by the sound, looked up, instead of the flat disk of canework on which Paolu had so wondrously ascended, they beheld a cabbage-shaped mass of green, which shot forth every moment long pointed satiny leaves of the tenderest green, and the most graceful shape imaginable. But where was Paolu? Some fancied that in the yellow crown that topped the cabbage-shaped bud of this strange tree they could see the tip of his cap, and distinguish his black roguish eyes. But that may have been all fancy, and they were quickly diverted from their search for the conjurer by a shower of red, pulpy fruits that began to fall with great rapidity from the miraculous tree. Of course there was a scramble in which the mandarins themselves did not disdain to join, and the crimson fruits, the like of which no one in Qingtao had ever seen before, proved delightfully sweet and palatable to the taste. That's right! Perfectly bred and very polite people!" cried a shrill voice while they were all scrambling for the crimson fruits. "Pick fruit while it is fresh, and tea while it is tender, for the sun wilts and the chills toughen, and the bluest plum blooms only for a day." Everybody looked up, and lo, there was Paolu, as large as life, strutting upon the stage, waving a large green fan in his hand. While the crowd was yet considering this wonderful reappearance of the conjurer, there was heard a very great outcry at the end of the street, and a tall, thin man in a coarse blue gown came running up at full speed.
"Where are my plums, son of thieves?" he cried, almost breathless with haste. "Alas, alas, I am completely ruined. My wife will perish miserably for want of food, and my sons will inherit nothing but empty baskets at my death. Where are my plums?"
"Who is it that dares to address the virtuous and well-disposed people of Qingtao after this fashion?"
demanded the Mandarin Lin, in a haughty voice as he confounded the newcomer. The poor man, seeing the gilt ball, became immediately very humble and bowed several times to the Mandarin.
"Oh, my lord," said he, "I am an incapable and undeserving plum-seller named Liu. I was just now sitting at my stall in a neighboring street selling 5 cash worth of plums to a customer, when suddenly all the plums rose out of my baskets as if they had wings of hawks, and flew through the air over the tops of houses in this direction. Thinking myself the sport of demons, I ran after them, hoping to catch them, and... Ah, there are my plums!" he cried suddenly, interrupting himself and making a dart at some of the crimson fruits that the tailor Hang held in his hand, intending to carry them home to his wife.
"These are your plums?"
screamed Hang, defending his treasure vigorously.
"Mole that you are, did you ever see scarlet plums?"
"This man is stricken by heaven," said Paolu gravely. "He is a fool who hides his plums and then thinks that they fly away. Let someone shake his gown."
A porcelain cobbler who stood near the fruiterer immediately seized the long blue robe and gave it a lusty pull, when, to the wonder of everybody, thousands of the most beautiful plums fell out as from a tree shaken by the winds of autumn. At this moment a great gust of wind arose in the street, and a pillar of dust mounted up to the very top of the strange tree that still stood waving its long satiny leaves languidly above the housetops. For an instant everyone was blinded, and when the dust had subsided so as to permit the people to use their eyes again, the wonderful tree had completely vanished, and all that could be seen was a little bamboo stool flying along the road where it was blown by the storm. The poor fruiterer Liho stood aghast, looking at the plums in which he stood knee-deep. The mandarin, addressing him, said sternly,
"Let us hear no more such folly from Liho. Otherwise he will get 20 strokes of the stick." "Gather your plums, Liho," said Paolu kindly, "and think this one of your fortunate days. For he who runs after his losses with open mouth does not always overtake them."
And as the conjurer descended from his platform, it did not escape the sharp eyes of the little tailor Hong that Paolu exchanged a mysterious signal with the mandarin Wei Cheng-zhe. The chapter of the Shadow of the Duck. It was close on nightfall when Paolu stopped before Wei Cheng-zhe's house. The lanterns were already lit, and the porter dozed in a bamboo chair so soundly that Paolu entered the porch and passed the screen without awaking him. The inner room was dimly lighted by some horn lanterns, elegantly painted with hunting scenes. But despite the obscurity, the conjurer could discover Wei Cheng-zhe seated at the farther end of the apartment on an inclined couch covered with blue and yellow satin. Along the corridor that led to the women's apartments, the shadows lay thick, but Paolu fancied he could hear the pattering of little feet upon the matted floor, and see the twinkle of curious eyes illuminating the solemn darkness. Yet, after all, he may have been mistaken, for the corridor opened on a garden wealthy in the rarest flowers, and he may have conceived the silver dripping of the fountain to be pattering of dainty feet, and have mistaken the moonlight shining on the moist leaves of the lotus for the sparkle of women's eyes.
"Has Paolu arrived in my dwelling?"
asked Wei Cheng-zhe from the dim corner in which he lay.
"That ignoble and wrath-deserving personage bows his head before you,"
answered Paolu, advancing and saluting the mandarin in accordance with the laws of the Book of Rites.
"I hope that you performed your journey hither in great safety and peace of mind,"
said Wei Cheng-zhe, gracefully motioning to the conjurer to seat himself on a small blue sofa that stood at a little distance.
"When so mean an individual as Paolu is honored by the request of the noble Wei Cheng-zhe, good fortune must attend him. How could it be otherwise?"
replied Paolu, seating himself not on the small blue sofa, but on the satin one which was partly occupied by the mandarin himself.
"Paolu did not send in his name as the rites direct,"
said Wei Cheng-zhe, looking rather disgusted by this impertinent freedom on the part of the conjurer.
"The elegant porter that adorns the noble porch of Wei Cheng-zhe was fast asleep," answered Paolu, and Paolu knew that the great mandarin expected him with impatience. "Yes," said Wei Cheng-zhe, "I am oppressed by 1,000 demons. Devils sleep in my hair, and my ears are overflowing with evil spirit. I cannot rest at night, and feel no pleasure in the day. Therefore was it that I wished to see you, in hopes that you would, by amusing the demon that inhabits my stomach, induce him to depart." "I will endeavor to delight the respectable demon who lodges in your stomach with my unworthy conjurations," replied Paolu. "But first I must go into the garden to gather flowers." "Go," said Wei Cheng-zhe. "The moon shines, and you will see there very many rare and beautiful plants that are beloved by my daughter Wu." "The moonlight itself cannot shine brighter on the lilies than the glances of your lordship's daughter," said the conjurer, bowing and proceeding to the garden. Ah, what a garden it was that Paolu now entered! The walls that surrounded it were lofty and built of a rosy stone brought from the mountains of Manchuria. This wall, on whose inner face flowery designs and triumphal processions were sculptured at regular intervals, sustained the long and richly laden shoots of the white magnolia, which spread its large snowy chalices in myriads over the surface. Tamarisks and palms sprang up in various parts of the grounds like dark columns supporting the silvery sky, while the tender and mournful willow drooped its delicate limbs over numberless fish ponds, whose waters seemed to repose peacefully in the bosom of the emerald turf. The air was distracted with innumerable perfumes, each more fragrant than the other. The blue convolvulus,
the crimson ipomea, the prodigal azaleas, the spotted tiger lilies, the timid and half-hidden jasmine, all poured forth during the day and night, streams of perfume from the inexhaustible fountains of their chalices. The heavy odors of the tuberose floated languidly through the leaves, as a richly plumaged bird would float through summer air, borne down by his own splendor. The blue lotus slept on the smooth waves of the fish ponds in sublime repose. There seemed an odor of enchantment over the entire place. The flowers whispered their secrets in the perfumed silence. The inmost heart of every blossom was unclosed at that mystic hour. All the magic and mystery of plants floated abroad, and the garden seemed filled with the breath of 1,000 spells. But amidst the lilies and lotuses, amidst the scented roses and the drooping convolvuli, there moved a flower fairer than all. "I am here," whispered a low voice, and a dusky figure came gliding toward Paolu as he stood by the fountain. "Ah," said the conjurer, in a tender tone far different from the shrill one in which he addressed the crowd opposite the Hotel of the 32 Virtues. "The garden is now complete. Wu, the rose of completed beauty, has blossomed on the night. Let Paolu shelter her under his mantle from the cold winds of evening, and bear her company for a little while, for she has grown up under a lonely wall," said Wu, laying her little hand gently on the conjurer's arm, and nestling up to his side, as a bird nestles up into the fallen leaves warmed by the sun. "She can lie there but a little while," answered Paolu, folding the mandarin's daughter in a passionate embrace, "for Wei Cheng-zhe awaits the coming of Paolu impatiently, in order to have a conjuration with the devil that inhabits his stomach." "Alas," said Wu sadly, "why do you not seek some other and more distinguished employment than that of a conjurer? Why do you not seek distinction in the palace of literary composition, and obtain a style? Then we need not meet in secret, and you might without fear demand my hand from my father." Paolu smiled almost scornfully. He seemed to gain an inch in stature, and looked around him with an air of command. "The marble from which the statue is to be carved must lie in the quarry until the workmen find it," he answered, "and the hour of my destiny has not yet arrived." "Well, we must wait, I suppose," said Wu with a sigh. "Meantime, Paolu, I love you." "The hour will come sooner than you think," said Paolu, returning her caress. "And now go, for the mandarin awaits." Wu glided away through the gloom to her own apartment, while the conjurer passed rapidly through the garden and gathered the blossoms of certain flowers as he went. He seemed to linger with a strange delight over the buds bathed in the moonlight and the dew. Their perfume ascended into his nostrils like incense, and he breathed it with a voluptuous pleasure. "Now let the demon tremble in the noble stomach of Wei Cheng-zhe," said Paolu as he re-entered the hall of reception, laden with flowers. "This ill-favored personage will make such conjurations as shall delight the soul of the elegant and well-born mandarin, and cause his illustrious persecutor to fly terrified." Paolu then stripped off the petals from many of the flowers, and gathered them in a heap on the floor. The mass of leaves was indeed variegated. The red of the quamaclet, the blue of the convolvulus, the tender pink of the camellia, the waxen white of the magnolia, were all mingled together like the 1,000 hues in the scarfs of felicity. Having built this confused mass of petals in the shape of a pyramid, Paolu unwound a scarf from his waist and flung it over the heap. He then drew the piece of jade stone from his pocket and said, "This personage of outrageous presence desires that what will be may be shown to the lofty mandarin, Wei Cheng-zhe." As he pronounced these words, he twitched the scarf away with a rapid jerk, and lo, the flower leaves were gone, and in their place stood a beautiful mandarin duck, in whose gorgeous plumage one might trace the brilliant hues of the flowers. Paolu now approached the duck, caught it up with one hand, while with the other he drew a sharp knife from his girdle and severed the bird's head from its body at a single stroke. To the great astonishment of Wei Cheng-zhe, the body and dismembered head of the bird vanished the moment the knife had passed through the neck. But at the same instant a duck, resembling it in every respect, escaped from the conjurer's hands and flew across the room. When I say that this duck resembled the other in every respect, I mean only in shape, size, and colors. For the rest, it was no bodily duck. It was impalpable and transparent, and even when it flew, it made no noise with its wings.
"This is indeed wonderful," said Wei Cheng-zhe. "Let the marvelous conjurer explain." "The duck formed out of flowers was a duck pure in body and spirit," most lofty mandarin," said Paolu. "And when it died under the knife, I ordered its soul to pass into its shadow, which can never be killed. Hence the shadow of the duck has all the colors as well as the intelligence of the real duck that gave it birth." "And to what end has the very wise Paolu created this beautiful duck shadow?" asked the mandarin. "The cultivated Wei Cheng Zhe shall immediately behold," answered the conjurer, drawing from his wide sleeve a piece of rock salt and flinging it to the farther end of the room. He had hardly done this when a terrific sound between a bark and a howl issued from the dim corner into which he had cast the rock salt, and immediately a large gray wolf issued wonderfully from out of the twilight and rushed with savage fangs upon the shadow of the beautiful duck. "Why, it is a wolf from the forests of Manchuria!"
exclaimed Wei Cheng Zhe, rather alarmed at this frightful apparition.
"This is no shadow, but a living and bloodthirsty beast." "Let my lord observe and have no fear," said Paolu tranquilly. The wolf seemed rather confounded when, on making a snap at the beautiful duck, his sharp fangs met no resistance, while the bird flew with wonderful venom straight at his fiery eyes. He growled and snapped and tore with his claws at the agile shadow that fluttered around and over him, but all to no purpose. As well might the hound leap at the reflection of the deer in the pool where he drinks. The shadow of the beautiful duck seemed all the while to possess some strange, deadly influence over the savage wolf. His growls grew fainter and fainter, and his red and flaming eyes seemed to drop blood. His limbs quivered all over, and the rough hairs of his coat stood on end with terror and pain, the shadow of the beautiful duck never ceasing all the time to fly straight at his eyes. "The wolf is dying,"
exclaimed Wei Cheng Zhe.
"He will die. Die like a dog," said Paolu in a tone of savage triumph. And presently, as he predicted, the wolf gave 2 or 3 faint howls, turned himself round in a circle as if making a bed to sleep on, and then laid down and died. The shadow of the beautiful duck seemed now to be radiant with glory. It shook its bright wings, that were lovely and transparent as a rainbow, and mounting on the dead body of the wolf, sat in majesty upon his grim and shaggy throne. "And what means this strange exhibition, learned and wise conjurer?"
asked Wei Cheng Zhe, with a sorely troubled air.
"I will tell you," said Paolu, suddenly dropping his respectful and ceremonious language, and lifting his hand with an air of supreme power. "The mandarin duck, elegant, faithful, and courageous, is an emblem of the dynasty of Ming, that true Chinese race that ruled so splendidly in this land before the invaders usurped the throne. The cowardly and savage wolf is a symbol of the Manchu Tartar robbers who slew our liberties, shaved our heads, and enchained our people. The time has now arrived when the duck has recovered its splendor and its courage and is going to kill the wolf. For the wolf cannot bite it, as it works like a shadow in the twilight and mystery of secret association. This you know, Wei Cheng Zhe, as well as I." "I have indeed heard of a rebel Chinese named Tian Te, who has raised a flame in our peaceful land, and who, proclaiming himself a lineal descendant of the dynasty of Ming, seeks to dethrone our wise and heavenly sovereign, Hian Fung." "Lie not to me, Wei Cheng Zhe, for I know your inmost thoughts. Chinese as you are, I know that you hate the Tartar in your heart, but you are afraid to say so, for fear of losing your head." The mandarin was so stupefied at this audacious address that he could not reply, while the conjurer continued. "I come to make you an offer. Join the forces of the heaven-descended Emperor Tian Te. Join with him in expelling this tyrannical Tartar race from the central kingdom and driving them back again to their cold hills and barren deserts. Fly with me to the imperial camp, and bring with you your daughter Wu, the golden heart of the lily, and I promise you the command of 1/3 of the imperial forces and the presidency of the College of Ceremonies." "And who are you, who dare to ask of Wei Cheng Zhe to bestow on you his nobly born daughter?" said Wei Cheng Zhe, starting in an outrage from his couch. "I?" replied Paolu, shaking his conjurer's gown from his shoulders and displaying a splendid garment of yellow satin, on the breast of which was emblazoned the imperial dragon. "I am your Emperor Tian Te."
"Ha!" screamed a shrill voice behind him at this moment.
"Here he is, the elegant and noble rebel for whose head our worthy emperor has offered a reward of 10,000 silver taels. Here he is. Catch, beautiful and noble mandarins, catch him, and I will pay my creditors with the head money."
Paolu turned and beheld the little tailor Hung Pu, at whose back were a whole file of soldiers and a number of mandarins. Wei Cheng-zhe shuddered, for in this compromise of his character he knew that his death was written, if he fell into the imperial hands. The chapter of All is over.
"Stately and intemperate tailor," said Paolu calmly, "why do you wish to arrest me?"
"How? Because I will get a reward, and I want to pay my debts,"
said Hang Pu, grinning spitefully.
"A reward for me, the miserable and marrowless conjurer, Paolu?
Oh, elegant cutter of summer gowns, your well-educated brains are not at home."
"Oh, we know you well enough, mighty conjurer. You are none other than the contumacious rebel Tian-te, who dares to claim the throne held by the wise and merciful Hian Fung, and we will bear you to the court of Peking in chains, so that you may wither in the light of his terrible eyes."
"You think you will get a reward of 10,000 silver taels for my head?"
cried Paolu.
"Certainly,"
replied the little tailor, rubbing his hands with glee.
"Certainly. His unmatched and isolated majesty has promised it, and the brother of the sun never lies."
"Listen, inventive closer of symmetrical seams. Listen, and I will tell you what will become of your 10,000 silver taels. There is a long avenue leading to the imperial treasury, and at every second step is an open hand. When the 10,000 taels are poured out, the first hand grasps a half, the second hand an eighth of the remaining half, the third hand grasps a fourth of the rest, and when the money bags get down a little lower, all the hands grasp together, so that when the bags reach the little tailor Hang Pu, who stands stamping his feet very far down indeed, they are entirely empty, for Tartar robbers surround the throne, and a Tartar usurper sits upon it, and the great Chinese nation toils in its rice fields to gild their palaces and fill their seraglios, and for all they give get neither justice nor mercy. But I, Tian-te, the heavenly emperor of this central land, will ordain it otherwise, and hurl the false dragon from his throne. For it is written in the book of prognostics, a copy of which was brought to me on the wings of a yellow serpent, that the dynasty of Han shall rule once more, and the Tartar wolves perish miserably out of the land of flowers."
"This is treason against the light of the universe."
"Our most gracious emperor," said the Mandarin Lin, "you shall have 70 times 7 pounds of cold iron put upon your neck for these blasphemies, and I will promise you that many bamboo splinters shall be driven up under your rebellious nails."
"Let our ears be no longer filled with these atrocious utterances,"
cried Hang Pao.
"O brave and splendid mandarins, order your terrifying tigers to arrest this depraved rebel in order that we may hasten with him to Peking."
"Before you throw the chains of sorrow around my neck, O tailor of celestial inspirations," said Paolu with calm mockery, "before the terrible weight of your just hand falls upon me, I pray you, if you would oblige me, to look at that duck." So saying, Paolu pointed to where the shadow of the duck was sitting on the body of the wolf.
"Oh, what a beautiful duck!"
cried Hang Pao, with glistening eyes and clapping his hands.
"Let us try and catch him."
"It is indeed a majestic duck,"
said Mandarin Lin, gravely stroking his mustache. "I am favorable to his capture."
"You will wait until we catch the duck, illustrious rebel,"
said Hang Pao to Paolu, very innocently, never turning his eyes from the duck, to which they seemed to be glued by some singular spell of attraction.
"I will talk with the Mandarin Wei Cheng-zhe while you put your noble maneuvers into motion," answered Paolu.
"Now let us steal upon the duck,"
said Hang Pao.
"Handsomely formed duck, we entreat of you to remain as quiet as possible in order that we may grasp you in our hands."
Then, as if actuated by a single impulse, the entire crowd, with the exception of Wei Cheng-zhe and Paolu, moved toward the duck. The mandarins stepped on tiptoe, with bent bodies and little black eyes glistening with eagerness. Hang Pu crawled on his belly like a serpent, and the soldiers, casting aside their bows and shields, crept with their hands upon their sides toward the beautiful bird. The duck remained perfectly quiet, its variegated wings shining like a painted tail, and its neck lustrous as the court robe of a first-class mandarin. The crowd scarcely breathed, so intense was their eagerness to capture the duck, and they moved slowly forward, gradually surrounding it. Hang Pu was the first to make a clutch at the bird, but he was very much astonished to find his hand closing on empty air, while the duck remained seated on the wolf, as still as a picture.
"Miserable tailor,"
cried the Mandarin Lin, "your hand is a sieve with meshes wide enough to strain elephants. How can you catch the beautiful duck? Behold me!" And Mandarin Lin made a rapid and well-calculated dive at the duck. To the wonderment of everyone except Paolu and Wei Cheng-zhe, the duck seemed to ooze through his fingers, and escaping, flew away to the other end of the room.
"If my hand is a sieve," said Hang Pu. "It is evident that the noble mandarin's hand is not a wall of beaten copper, for it lets ducks fly through with wonderful ease."
"It is a depraved and abominable duck of criminal parentage," said Mandarin Lin in a terrible rage, "and I vow by the whiskers of the dragon that I will catch it and burn it on a spit."
"Oh, yes!" cried the entire crowd, mandarins, soldiers, and the little tailor, all now attracted to the chase of the duck by a power that they could no longer resist.
"Oh, yes, we will most assuredly capture this little duck, and deprive him of his feathers, punish him on a spit that is exceedingly hot."
So the chase commenced. Here and there, from one corner to the other, up the walls, on the altar of the household gods, in short, in every possible portion of the large room, did the mandarins, the little tailor, and the soldiers pursue the shadow of the beautiful duck. Never was seen such a duck. It seemed to be in 20 places at a time. One moment, Mandarin Lin would throw himself bodily on the bird, in hopes of crushing it, and would call out triumphantly that now indeed he had the duck. But the words would be hardly out of his mouth when a loud shout from the rest of the party would disabuse his mind, and turning he would behold the duck marching proudly down the center of the floor. Another time a soldier would declare that he had the duck in his breeches pocket, but while his neighbors were carefully probing that recess, the duck would be seen calmly emerging from his right-hand sleeve. One time Hang Pu sat down suddenly on the mouth of a large china jar, and resolutely refused to stir, declaring that he had seen the duck enter the jar, and that he was determined to sit upon the mouth until the demon of a duck was starved to death. But even while uttering his heroic determination, his mouth was seen to open very wide, and to the astonishment of all, the duck flew out. In an instant the whole crowd was after him again. Mandarin Hai Lei, tumbling over Mandarin Qingze, and Mandarin Lin nearly drove his head through Hang Pu's stomach. The unhappy wretches began now to perspire and grow faint with fatigue, but the longer the chase went on, the hotter it grew. There was no rest for any of them. From corner to corner, from side to side, now in one direction, now in another. No matter whither the duck flew, they were compelled to follow. Their faces streamed, and their legs seemed ready to sink under them. Their eyeballs were ready to start out of their heads, and they had the air of government couriers who had traveled 500 li in 11 days. They were nearly dead.
"Those men will surely perish, illustrious claimant of the throne,"
said Wei Chengze, gazing with astonishment at this mad chase.
"Let them perish," said the conjurer. "So will perish all the enemies of the celestial sovereign, Tiu Te. Wei Chengze, once more, do you accept my offer? If you remain here, you will be sent to Peking in chains. If you come with me, I will gird your waist with the scarf of perpetual delight. We want wise men like you to guide our armies, and the illustrious Tian Te loves the mandarin's daughter,"
said Wei Chengze, roguishly finishing the sentence.
"Light of the universe and son of heaven, Wei Chengze is your slave."
Pao Lu, for I still call him by his conjurer's name, gave a low whistle, and, obedient to the summons, Wu's delicate shape came gliding from the corridor toward her lover, with the dainty step of a young fawn going to the fountain.
"Wu,"
said Pao Lu,
"the marble is carved, and the hour is come." "My father, then, has consented?"
said Wu, looking timidly at her father.
"When the emperor of the central land condescends to Wu, what father dare refuse?"
said Wei Chengze.
"Emperor,"
said Wu, opening her black eyes with wonder.
"My Pao Lu, an emperor?"
"I am indeed the son of the dragon,"
said Pao Lu, folding her to his breast.
"And you shall sit upon a throne of ivory and gold."
"And I thought you were only a conjurer,"
murmured Wu, hiding her head in his yellow gown.
"But how are we to leave this place?"
asked Wei Changze, looking alarmed.
"The guard will seize us if they get knowledge of your presence."
"We shall be at my castle in the mountains of Se-Hing, near the Koe Lin, in less than a minute," answered Paolu. "For to the possessor of the Dragon Fang, all things are possible." Even as he spoke, the ground began to slide from under their feet with wonderful rapidity, leaving them motionless and upright. Houses, walls, gardens, fields, all passed by them with the swiftness of a dream, until in a few seconds they found themselves in the mountain castle of Tian Te, where they were welcomed with a splendid hospitality. Wu became the favorite wife of the adventurous emperor, and Wei Changze, one of his most famous generals. The day after these events, some Tartar soldiers entered Wei Changze's house to search for the mandarin, when, in the reception hall, they were confounded at finding a number of men lying dead upon the floor, while in the midst sat a beautiful duck, that immediately on their entrance flew out through a window and was seen no more. The dead men were soon recognized, and it was the opinion of the people of Qing Tao that Wei Chengze had poisoned all the soldiers and mandarins and then fled. The tailor, Hung Pu, being among the corpses, was found to have given his creditors the slip forever. Victory still sits on the banner of Tian Te, and he will, without doubt, by the time that the tea is again fit to gather, sit upon the ancient throne of his ancestors. Everything is now gracefully concluded. End of section 13. End of The Diamond Lens with Other Stories by Fitz-James O'Brien.